What if I told you that one of the shortest wars in history, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, lasted less than an hour? That an entire country once went to battle against birds in the bizarre Emu War and lost? That one of history's most powerful leaders, Napoleon Bonaparte, was forced to retreat from a swarm of rabbits? That in the mighty Roman Empire, a horse named Incitatus was nearly made a government official? And that something as simple as a flower sparked mass panic and financial ruin during Tulip Mania? It sounds ridiculous, it sounds made up, but every one of these events actually happened, proving that history isn't just kings and battles, but a collection of moments so strange, so absurd, and so unbelievable that they feel like fiction. And by the end of this, you might start questioning how real history actually is. The dancing plague of 1518 began, as many catastrophes do, with a single person doing something unremarkable. It was July in Strasbourg. Strasbourg then being part of the Holy Roman Empire, a city of steep-roofed buildings and narrow cobblestone lanes that smelled of bread and tallow and the slow green rot of the Rhine. The summer of 1518 had been brutal. A series of harsh winters had preceded it, destroying harvests across the region. Famine was not a distant threat, but a daily companion, arriving each morning at the door in the shape of empty bowls and hollow-cheeked children. Smallpox moved through the population with quiet efficiency. Syphilis, a relative newcomer to Europe, added its own particular cruelties to the catalogue of suffering. The people of Strasbourg were not merely poor, they were exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. They were exhausted in their souls. Into this landscape of accumulated grief walked a woman named Frau Trophia. We do not know much about her personally. Her face is lost to history, her voice entirely silent, but we know what she did. On a day in mid-July of 1518, she stepped into a small square in Strasbourg and began to dance. She was not dancing with joy. There was no music. There was no festival, no celebration, no particular occasion to prompt movement of any kind. She simply began to move, and she did not stop. Her feet shuffled and stamped against the cobblestones. Her arms moved in patterns that may have resembled dance or may have resembled something else entirely, something more desperate, more involuntary. Neighbors gathered to watch. Some laughed, assuming she had gone briefly mad, or was drunk, or was performing some kind of private ritual. But the hours passed, and Frau Trophia did not stop. Evening fell. She danced. Night came. She collapsed from exhaustion, slept briefly, and when she woke, she danced again. Within a week, something extraordinary and terrifying had occurred. More people had joined her. Not by choice, or at least not by any choice they could consciously explain. One by one, then in small clusters, the citizens of Strasbourg began to dance alongside Frau Trophia. They danced until their shoes tore apart. They danced until their feet bled. They danced with expressions not of pleasure or celebration, but of anguish, mouths twisted, eyes unfocused, bodies moving with a mechanical compulsion that observers found deeply disturbing to witness. Some dancers reportedly foamed at the mouth. Some wept while dancing. Some begged to be stopped, even as their feet continued their relentless rhythm. By August, the number of dancers had swelled to somewhere between 50 and 400, depending on which contemporary account you trust. The city authorities, watching this spread with mounting alarm, did something that seems bizarre to modern eyes, but made a kind of desperate sense within their medical framework. They consulted physicians, who concluded, following the medical theories of the day, that the dancers were afflicted with hot blood and that the cure was more dancing. The authorities hired musicians. They cleared the guild hall and the horse market to provide space. They even brought in professional dancers, hoping that organized movement might somehow resolve the crisis that spontaneous movement had created. It did not help. The dancing continued. It spread. People were dying, not metaphorically, but literally. The physical toll of days of continuous, involuntary movement was catastrophic. Hearts gave out. Dancers collapsed from stroke and exhaustion. Some accounts put the death toll at 15 people per day at the peak of the outbreak, though historians debate this figure. What is less debatable is that the dancing plague of 1518 was real, documented in physicians' notes, in church records, in the observations of the city council, and that it defied then, as it defies now, any single clean explanation. Modern historians and medical researchers have offered several theories. Ergotism. a condition caused by consuming rye bread contaminated with ergot fungus, which can produce convulsions and hallucinations, has been proposed. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, is the most widely accepted explanation today. This is the theory that in populations under severe enough psychological stress, shared symptoms can spread through communities the way infectious diseases spread, bypassing the usual mechanisms of individual self-control and replacing them with something older and more primal. The dancing, in this reading, was not celebration and was not madness in the conventional sense. It was the body's desperate, collective attempt to discharge an unbearable psychological pressure that had been building for years. There is also a religious dimension that complicates any purely medical explanation. The cult of Saint Vitus was prominent in the region at the time, and Saint Vitus was associated both with the cure of and the cursing with involuntary movement. Some dancers were said to have invoked the saint's name during their ordeal. Some accounts describe the dancers being led to a hilltop shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus in the hopes that his intercession would end their suffering. Whether it did, whether the dancing simply burned itself out, whether the arrival of cooler autumn weather played a role, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that by September of 1518, the dancing had largely stopped. Frau Trophia disappears from the historical record after her name is first written down. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know whether she recovered, whether she died dancing, whether she lived long enough to watch the strange fire she had somehow ignited finally go cold. She exists now only as the beginning of a story that no one, in 5 centuries of trying, has fully managed to explain. And perhaps that is precisely what makes it worth remembering. If the dancing plague asks us to reckon with the mysterious depths of human suffering, then the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which unfolded on a bright and particular morning in August of 1896, asks us to reckon with something rather different. The almost farcical efficiency with which power, once fully assembled, can be applied. The island of Zanzibar in the late 19th century was a place of extraordinary richness and complexity. Off the eastern coast of Africa, in the warm shallows of the Indian Ocean, Zanzibar had for centuries been one of the great crossroads of the world. Arab traders had come here, Persian merchants, Indian spice traders, the Portuguese, and then the Omani Arabs, and then, gradually and inexorably, the British, who arrived with the particular combination of commercial interest and moral certainty that characterized so much of Victorian-era expansion. By the 1890s, Zanzibar was technically an independent sultanate, but the nature of that independence was constrained by the presence of a British consul whose opinions carried considerably more weight than diplomatic courtesy alone might have warranted. The Sultan in 1896 was a man named Hamad bin Thawani, and his relationship with the British was, if not warm, at least functional. He understood the terms of the arrangement. He governed, within limits. The British advised, within those same limits. And everyone moved forward with a kind of careful, choreographed mutual awareness of where the invisible lines were drawn. Then, on the 25th of August, 1896, Sultan Hamad bin Thawani died. The cause of his death was listed as natural causes. Some people, then and since, have wondered about this. But whatever the truth of his passing, his death triggered an immediate crisis, because into the palace, before the British consul could properly assess and approve of a successor, stepped a man named Khalid bin Barkash. Khalid was the Sultan's cousin. He was ambitious, energetic, and possessed of what might charitably be called an imperfect understanding of the geopolitical realities of his situation. He seized the palace, surrounded it with his own guards, and declared himself the new Sultan of Zanzibar. He gathered weapons. He assembled what he could of the Zanzibari military, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men, armed with rifles, old cannons, and whatever additional weaponry could be mustered on short notice, including, memorably, a royal yacht that he decided to press into service as a warship. The yacht was called the HHS Glasgow. It had decorative cannons. It was not, in any rigorous military sense, a warship, but Khalid was working with what he had. The British consul, one Basil Cave, sent a message to Khalid with considerable directness: stand down, surrender the palace, and do not, under any circumstances, raise the Zanzibari flag, as the raising of that flag would be interpreted as an act of war. Khalid raised the flag. In Whitehall and in the offices of the Royal Navy, the response was not panic but procedure. British warships were already in the harbor at Zanzibar, as they generally tended to be in this period of imperial history. An ultimatum was issued: surrender by 9 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of August, or face the consequences. The British were not bluffing, and at some level, even Khalid must have understood this. But he did not stand down. Perhaps he believed that the British would hesitate. Perhaps he believed that the optics of bombarding a palace on a small tropical island would be sufficiently unfavorable to give them pause. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to capitulate. At 9 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of August, 1896, the British warships in the harbor of Zanzibar opened fire. What followed lasted, depending on how precisely you time it, between 38 and 45 minutes. The Zanzibari palace, which was not designed to withstand naval bombardment, did not withstand naval bombardment. The decorative cannons on the royal yacht returned fire briefly before the yacht was sunk in the harbor, its hull settling into the shallow water with a kind of defeated finality. The 2,000 to 3,000 defenders scattered. Khalid bin Barghash fled the palace through a rear exit, sought refuge in the German consulate, and eventually went into exile, living out his remaining decades in a condition of comfortable irrelevance. The British casualties in the Anglo-Zanzibar War: one sailor, lightly wounded. The Zanzibari casualties: somewhere between 500 and 550 killed, though again, exact figures are uncertain. The war was over before many of the city's residents had finished their morning tea. It has since entered the record books as the shortest war in history, a distinction that carries within it more weight than it might initially appear to. Because the war's brevity was not accidental, and it was not a matter of luck. It was the result of an enormous and carefully maintained asymmetry of force. Decades of imperial accumulation that had concentrated, in those warships in the harbor, a degree of destructive capability so vastly disproportionate to anything Khalid could marshal that the outcome was, in some deep sense, decided before the first gun was fired. Khalid bin Barghash lived until 1927. He died in Mombasa. He had spent 31 years in exile, outliving by decades the empire he had briefly, disastrously, and rather courageously attempted to resist. Whether that constitutes tragedy or merely irony depends, perhaps, on where you are standing when the flags go up. From the cold efficiency of colonial power, we move now to something that requires a slightly different kind of reckoning, the kind that involves the government of Australia, approximately 20,000 emus, and a level of operational humiliation that the Australian military has spent roughly a century doing its best to forget. The Great Emu War unfolded in the Campion district of Western Australia in the year 1932, during a time when the country was navigating the compounding miseries of the Great Depression and the particular agricultural challenges of a landscape that had never been especially cooperative with human intentions. The setting is important to hold in mind. The Western Australian outback is not a place designed for human comfort. It is vast and brown and hot in ways that challenge even the most optimistic temperament, a landscape of red dust and scrub brush and distances so enormous that they function almost as a form of psychological pressure. The farmers who had settled in the Campion district after the First World War, many of them veterans who had been offered land grants as partial compensation for what the war had taken from them, were already struggling. The Depression had collapsed wheat prices. Drought had reduced yields. And now, arriving with a timing that seemed almost maliciously precise, came the emus. The emu is, in the natural history of animals that have had the misfortune to interact with organized human military force, a genuinely remarkable creature. It stands nearly 6 feet tall. It runs at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, with a gait that somehow manages to look both ridiculous and deeply threatening. Its feathers, distributed loosely around a body that seems slightly too large to be entirely serious, are the color of dried grass, which makes the animal surprisingly difficult to see clearly in its natural habitat. And it is, in ways that would prove relevant in 1932, extraordinarily difficult to kill with a machine gun. More on that shortly. In 1932, a flock of emus, approximately 20,000 strong, migrated into the Campion district in search of water and the wheat that the desperate farmers had planted there. They destroyed crops with cheerful indifference. They damaged fencing designed to keep rabbits out, creating gaps that allowed other pests to follow. They ate. They knocked things over. They continued eating. The farmers, already operating at the edge of financial viability, appealed to the government for help. The government of Australia, surveying this situation, made a decision that has since achieved a kind of legendary status in the annals of questionable military deployments. They sent the army. Specifically, they sent Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, accompanied by 2 soldiers and 2 Lewis guns, light machine guns capable of firing several hundred rounds per minute. The public relations dimension of this deployment was not ignored. A journalist was invited along to document what everyone assumed would be a straightforward and satisfying demonstration of industrial firepower applied to agricultural pest control. What followed was not straightforward. It was not satisfying, and it did not make for the kind of press coverage that anyone had anticipated. The emus proved to be, in the technical military terminology, exceedingly difficult to suppress. The first engagement took place near a dam where several hundred emus had gathered. The soldiers waited until the birds were in range, opened fire, and then discovered several things in rapid succession. First, that emus, when fired upon, scatter in multiple directions simultaneously rather than bunching together in a convenient target group. Second, that the Lewis guns jammed with some frequency in the dusty outback conditions. And third, most disturbingly, that individual emus, even when struck by multiple bullets, often simply continued moving. Their feathers and loose body fat seemed to absorb gunfire in ways that contradicted everything the soldiers had reasonably expected. Major Meredith, with the shell-shocked candor of a man who has been defeated by birds, later told a journalist that the emus could face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. He noted that they had a bloody great hide, and that killing them required several bullets each, which made the operation prohibitively expensive in terms of ammunition. In the first 10 days of the campaign, approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition were expended. The number of confirmed emu kills was somewhere in the hundreds, a ratio that delighted critics of the operation and appalled its architects. The campaign was suspended after 12 days, then resumed, then suspended again. A member of Parliament in Canberra, rising to ask about the progress of the Emu War, was met with information that the government found genuinely difficult to frame as a success. The ornithologist Dominic Cerveny, commenting on the emu's performance, offered what may be the most generous assessment in the historical record. He noted that the bird's ability to absorb punishment and continue functioning was testimony to a remarkable vitality. If there were any military dispatches from the emu side of the engagement, they would presumably have been quite favorable. By the end of the operation, the emus had not been meaningfully reduced in number. They had not been driven from the farming areas with any lasting effect. The farmers continued to suffer. Major Meredith had expended thousands of rounds of government ammunition to kill, by the most generous estimates, perhaps a tenth of the birds that had originally invaded the district. The operation was declared, in the careful language of official disappointment, to have achieved its objectives to the degree possible under difficult field conditions. The emus, for their part, remained in Western Australia. They are still there. They outnumber the human population of the state by a comfortable margin, which is either a reassuring fact about the resilience of wildlife or a quietly unsettling one about the limits of human control, depending on your perspective. The histories we have traveled through so far share a quality of grand scale. Thousands of dancers, thousands of emus, the full weight of imperial naval power. But history is also made in smaller spaces, in single streets, in the gap between an ordinary afternoon and an extraordinary one. And so we arrive now in the St. Giles parish of London, in the autumn of 1814, where a chain of events was about to begin that would end in something so improbable it would be reported in the newspapers with barely disguised disbelief. The Moo & Company Brewery sat on Tottenham Court Road in an area of London that was, in 1814, deeply, compressively poor. The St. Giles Rookery, a labyrinthine slum of collapsed and subdivided buildings housing thousands of people in conditions of extraordinary density and squalor, lay just adjacent. These were the kinds of streets where families of 6 or 8 lived in a single room, where children played in lanes that functioned also as open sewers, where the line between surviving and not surviving was drawn daily and did not always land on the favorable side. It was not a neighborhood with many buffers against disaster. The brewery itself was one of the industrial landmarks of the area, a massive operation producing enormous quantities of porter, the dark, cheap, heavy ale that was the drink of choice for London's laboring poor. The brewery's equipment included a number of enormous wooden fermentation vats, bound with great iron rings, and these vats held staggering quantities of beer. The largest of them held well over 3,000 barrels of porter, aged and fermenting in the particular way that porter required, which involved long maturation periods and the building up of significant internal pressure. On the afternoon of October 17, 1814, a fermentation vat in the brewery, one of the very large ones, developed a problem with the iron hoop that held it together. The hoop ruptured. The pressure inside the vat was sufficient to cause the rupture to immediately worsen. And as the hoop failed, the vat effectively exploded, releasing its contents with a force powerful enough to knock over the other vats nearby. In a cascade that took only moments to complete, the better part of the brewery's stored porter was in motion. More than 100,000 gallons of beer, some estimates put it at closer to 135,000 gallons, burst through the brewery walls and into the streets of St. Giles. The wave was between 15 and 20 feet high at its initial force. It demolished brick walls. It knocked down the side of a house in New Street in which a small girl was celebrating her wake, the Irish tradition of sitting with the dead, and buried the mourners under a surge of dark liquid. It flooded cellars throughout the neighborhood, where some residents had gone to shelter from what they thought was a minor commotion. The basements filled faster than people could climb out of them. 8 people died in the London beer flood of 1814, 7 by drowning in beer, and 1, reportedly, from alcohol poisoning, having consumed too much of the flood water in the aftermath. The neighborhood's reaction in the immediate hours after the flood was, by contemporary accounts, varied. Some residents attempted to salvage what beer they could, scooping it from the streets in pots and containers. Others arrived from surrounding areas, having heard about the disaster, to participate in what was apparently a spontaneous and very large communal drinking session in the flooded streets. The London press reported on this aspect of the event with a mixture of horror and amusement that reveals something rather specific about the class attitudes of the era. The Moo Brewery attempted to claim the lost beer as a tax rebate from the government on the grounds of unforeseeable catastrophic loss. After some negotiation, the claim was granted. The dead were buried. The streets dried. The brewery rebuilt and continued to operate for another 40 years, though it would never again achieve quite the same level of notoriety. The St. Giles Rookery itself, that dense, lightless accumulation of poverty, would be partially demolished in the decades that followed in the great slum clearances of Victorian London. The people who had lived there were dispersed into other dense, lightless accumulations of poverty elsewhere in the city. Progress, in 19th century London, often worked this way, solving the immediate problem by relocating it slightly to the left. The flood itself has become, over the 2 centuries since it occurred, something of a beloved historical curiosity, a story that people repeat with a kind of delighted disbelief, as though its strangeness is its most important quality. But beneath the strangeness lies something else. 8 people died in their own neighborhood on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, buried under a wave of something their neighbors drank recreationally. The line between the ordinary and the catastrophic was, in St. Giles in 1814, extremely thin. It generally is, in places like that. There are moments in the careers of great historical figures where the historical record offers something unexpected, not a grand battle or a sweeping political gesture, but a small, farcical scene that somehow feels more revealing of the person than any of the famous set pieces. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, conqueror of much of Europe, administrator of genius and general of supernatural ability, has one such scene in his biography. It occurred in July of 1807, and it involved rabbits. The context is worth dwelling on for a moment. Napoleon in the summer of 1807 was at an extraordinarily high point in his career. He had just concluded the treaties of Tilsit, a pair of agreements signed on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River in what is now Lithuania, that effectively reshaped the map of Europe in his favor. Russia had agreed to an alliance. Prussia was humiliated. Austria had already been dealt with. Napoleon stood, in July of 1807, at something very close to the summit of his power, a man who had bent the most complex political and military situations in the world to his will through sheer force of intelligence and determination. He decided to celebrate with a rabbit hunt. The celebration was to take place in the French countryside. Napoleon had tasked his chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, with organizing the event, and Berthier had gone about the task with his characteristic administrative thoroughness. The rabbits needed for the hunt were assembled. Estimates of the number range from several hundred to as many as 3,000, depending on the source, and kept in cages until the day of the event. On the appointed morning, Napoleon arrived with his marshals and a considerable entourage. The cages were opened. The hunt began, and then the rabbits, instead of scattering across the field as wild rabbits would have done, turned and advanced on the hunting party in a solid mass. The explanation for this behavior, which took everyone present completely by surprise, is straightforward in retrospect, but apparently did not immediately occur to anyone at the time. Berthier's men, in their efficiency, had not sourced wild rabbits for the hunt. They had sourced domestic rabbits. Domestic rabbits, having been raised near humans and associating human presence with feeding time, did not interpret the arrival of Napoleon and his marshals as a threat to be fled from. They interpreted it as a meal to be approached with some urgency. What followed was, by multiple contemporary accounts, genuinely alarming. The domestic rabbits surged toward Napoleon in a wave that eyewitnesses described as essentially unstoppable. Napoleon attempted to fight them off with his riding crop. His marshals attempted to assist. The servants tried to drive the rabbits back with sticks and brooms. None of it worked. The rabbits swarmed over boots and against legs and up onto coat tails with a cheerful single-mindedness that bore no relation to any rabbit behavior Napoleon had previously encountered. He retreated. He retreated further. The rabbits followed. Eventually, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had not been routed in the field by any human opponent in more than a decade, was forced to retreat to his carriage and depart the scene entirely. The rabbits, having confirmed their dominance of the situation, presumably milled around for a while and eventually dispersed. The incident was recorded by several witnesses, including Berthier himself, who seems to have found the whole thing at least partly his own fault and was not entirely amused. Napoleon's reaction is not fully documented, but we might speculate that it was somewhere in the vicinity of intense irritation. He was not, by temperament, a man who reacted well to losing. History has found a way to use this story in almost every possible register, as comedy, as metaphor, as a small humanizing detail in the otherwise titanic narrative of Napoleon's career. There is something undeniably appealing about the idea that the man who had defeated the armies of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and most of the other powers of Europe met his match in a field of domesticated rabbits. It suggests a certain democracy in the universe's sense of humor, a willingness to puncture grandeur at unexpected moments with something entirely undignified. Napoleon's downfall, when it finally came, would involve rather larger animals, specifically the Russian winter and the long logistical nightmare of the 1812 campaign. But it is worth remembering that years before that catastrophe, in a French field in the summer of his greatest triumph, he had already experienced, in miniature, the particular humiliation of being routed by an enemy he had catastrophically underestimated. From France in the summer of imperial triumph, we travel westward and forward in time, arriving in Boston, Massachusetts, in the January of 1919, in a neighborhood called the North End. It is a cold day, the kind of cold that Boston winters specialize in, with a particular sharpness to the air that comes off the harbor and finds every gap in the architecture. The streets are narrow. The North End is one of the oldest parts of the city, and its streets follow the logic of colonial-era settlement rather than any modern planning grid. There is a large industrial tank on Commercial Street, just north of where it meets the waterfront, and this tank belongs to the Purity Distilling Company. The tank is 50 feet tall. It is 90 feet in diameter, and it contains approximately 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Molasses, for those who have not thought much about it, is a byproduct of sugar refining, a thick, dark, viscous liquid that smells powerfully of sweetness and functions, in the right industrial context, as a formidable base for industrial alcohol, which in turn could be processed into munitions. The tank on Commercial Street had been built hastily, by some accounts, and had apparently shown warning signs before January of 1919. Rivets had popped. There had been reports of the tank groaning. Residents of the North End later recalled that molasses had seeped through the seams of the tank with enough regularity that local children had made a habit of collecting it. A free sweet treat from an industrial container that was, apparently, not as sealed as it should have been at approximately 12:40 in the afternoon on January 15, 1919, the tank failed. The failure was not a slow leak or a manageable rupture. It was a structural collapse of the entire vessel, releasing all 2.3 million gallons essentially at once. The explosion, because the force of it was enough to shake buildings and shatter windows and be heard from considerable distances, sent a wave of molasses through the streets of the North End at an initial speed that witnesses estimated at between 25 and 35 miles per hour. The wave was initially 8 to 15 feet high. The molasses swept over everything in its path with a force that was inconsistent with what most people understand of the substance's usual behavior. This was not the slow creep of a spilled jar. This was a moving wall of industrial-grade viscosity at significant velocity, and it hit the elevated railway structure nearby and buckled it. It hit buildings and demolished their lower floors. It swept people off their feet and held them down. It reached into basements. It overturned wagons and automobiles. It killed 21 people and injured 150 more. The specific nature of the deaths in the Boston molasses flood is, even at this distance of more than a century, genuinely difficult to contemplate. Many of the victims drowned, not in water, but in a substance too thick for normal swimming motions to be effective. Rescuers who arrived on scene found themselves trapped in the cooling, thickening molasses as they attempted to reach survivors. The substance clung to everything. It filled lungs. It glued clothing to pavement and pavement to skin. Horses caught in the flood struggled to rise and could not. The sounds of the scene, the calls for help, the sounds of animals in distress, the sucking noise of movement through 3 feet of cooling molasses, were described by survivors as something they could never fully leave behind. The cleanup of the Boston molasses flood took months. Firefighters pumped seawater from the harbor to try to dilute the substance, which spread through the North End streets and lanes and alleys, and into buildings and cellars, and eventually carried on the boots of passers-by, onto the floors of shops and restaurants throughout the downtown area. The harbor ran brown with diluted molasses for weeks. The smell of sweetness, residents reported, lingered in the neighborhood for years. Some claimed it could still be detected on the hottest summer days well into the 1920s. The Purity Distilling Company was sued by the city of Boston and by the families of the victims. The resulting lawsuit, one of the first major product liability cases in American legal history, eventually concluded in the company's liability for negligence, particularly regarding the hasty and inadequately designed construction of the tank. The judgment set a legal precedent that would resonate through American tort law for decades. The dead of the North End had, in the manner of those who suffer institutional negligence, done more for public safety in their dying than anyone could have imagined on that cold January afternoon. The tank was never rebuilt on that site. Commercial Street continued. The neighborhood continued. Boston continued, as cities do, carrying its losses forward. In the taxonomy of human suffering under extraordinary circumstances, there are people who endure things so statistically improbable that the mind reaches for some word other than luck, or some word other than misfortune, to describe their experience. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is one of those people. His story is one of the most remarkable in the recorded history of survival, and it is worth moving through it carefully, because the full weight of what he experienced cannot be grasped quickly. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in August of 1945. He had been on a 3-month work assignment in Hiroshima, and on August 6th, the last day of his assignment, as it happened, a morning when he was preparing to leave the city and return home, he arrived at the shipyard where he had been working and realized that he had left his travel permit at the office. He turned back to retrieve it. He was about 3 kilometers from the hypocenter of the atomic bomb when Little Boy detonated above Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945. The detonation produced a flash of light that witnesses described as impossible to look at directly, brighter than anything the sun produces at noon. a white-hot illumination that seemed to come from inside the air itself rather than from any point in the sky. The pressure wave followed almost instantly. Yamaguchi was thrown from his feet. The heat seared the exposed skin on the left side of his face and upper body. His eardrums were ruptured by the blast. He was temporarily blinded. He lay in a field while the city burned around him. And then, when he could move, he moved. He spent the night in a shelter. He helped other survivors. In the morning, he made his way through the burning ruins of Hiroshima to the railway station, and he did what humans do when they have survived something unsurvivable. He went home. He traveled to Nagasaki, his home city, the city where his family was waiting. He arrived with severe burns on his face and arms, his hair singed away, his eardrum ruptured. He received medical treatment. He rested. And on August 9th, 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, before the burns on his body had begun to heal, he went to the Mitsubishi offices in Nagasaki to report to his supervisor and explain that he had been present at an atomic bombing. The supervisor did not believe him. Or rather, the supervisor could not fully process what he was being told. The idea of a single bomb destroying an entire city was so far outside the framework of existing understanding that Yamaguchi's account seemed, in the moment, closer to delusion than to testimony. The supervisor asked him to explain. Yamaguchi was in the process of explaining when, at 11:02 in the morning on August 9, 1945, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki. Yamaguchi survived this one as well. He was approximately 3 kilometers from the hypocenter of the Nagasaki bomb, almost precisely the same distance he had been in Hiroshima. He was again thrown from his feet. Again, the world went white and then dark. Again, somehow, he was alive when it cleared. He lived with the consequences of this for decades: radiation exposure, the health complications that followed, and the particular psychological weight of being a person who had, by any reasonable calculation, been present when the atomic age announced itself twice. He married. He had children. He worked. He eventually began speaking publicly about what he had experienced, particularly as the decades brought renewed discussions of nuclear weapons and their proliferation. He became, late in his long life, a vocal advocate for nuclear disarmament, testifying before the United Nations, meeting with world leaders, carrying the specific authority of a man who had been in the radius of 2 atomic explosions and could describe, with complete personal accuracy, what they do to human beings and cities and the fabric of ordinary life. Japan officially recognized Yamaguchi in 2009 as a survivor of both bombings, one of a relatively small number of people who were officially documented in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though the actual number of double survivors is believed to be larger, perhaps in the dozens or even hundreds, many of whom never came forward. Tsutomu Yamaguchi died on January 4, 2010. He was 93 years old. In the 75 years after the bombs fell, he outlived almost everyone who had been near enough to either explosion to remember the light. There is no clean way to frame what his life represents. Survival, obviously. Endurance. Witness. But also something harder to name. The particular quality of a person who was put in the path of history's most destructive single moments twice, and who responded by spending his remaining decades insisting, publicly and with considerable moral force, that no one else should have to. There is a particular category of small American town in the early 20th century, the kind of town that has a single event for which it will forever be remembered, an event that arrived without warning and departed, leaving the town permanently, slightly, irreversibly changed. Irwin, Tennessee, is one of those towns, and the event is one of the stranger and more somber episodes in the history of traveling entertainment in America. Mary was an Asian elephant, a performing elephant who worked for the Sparks world-famous show Circus, which traveled by rail through the small towns of the American South in the years just before the First World War. She was billed, in the promotional language of the time, as the largest living land animal on Earth, and as 3 inches taller than Jumbo, the famous elephant of the previous generation. She was trained, she performed, she was photographed, and she was, by all accounts that survive, an effective and crowd-pleasing performer. On September 11, 1916, in the town of Kingsport, Tennessee, Mary was being led through the streets as part of the circus's arrival parade. She was being handled by a relatively inexperienced trainer named Red Eldridge, who had been given the job just the day before. At some point during the parade, the exact circumstances still not entirely clear, Mary pulled towards something at the side of the road. Some accounts say a piece of watermelon rind, others say a discarded drink, others are less specific, and when Eldridge used the bull hook to correct her, Mary reacted with sudden and fatal violence. She picked Eldridge up with her trunk, threw him to the ground, and stepped on his head. The response of the crowd was immediate and severe. There were calls for Mary's execution that afternoon. The circus owner, Charlie Sparks, found himself in a crisis that was simultaneously moral, financial, and logistical. If he did not execute the elephant, towns along the circuit were reportedly threatening to refuse to allow the circus entry. But the elephant was one of his most valuable performing animals, and the idea of losing her was a genuine economic blow. There were discussions of electrocuting her. Edison's company had famously electrocuted Topsy, another elephant, in 1903. There were discussions of shooting her. In the end, Sparks settled on a method that was both more definitive and more publicly spectacular: hanging. On September 13, 1916, in Irwin, Tennessee, Mary was brought to the local rail yard, where an industrial derrick, a large crane used for moving rail cars, was equipped with a chain. The chain was placed around Mary's neck. The derrick lifted her. The first attempt failed. The chain broke, or slipped, and Mary fell, suffering a broken hip. A second attempt succeeded. Mary died by hanging before a crowd of somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, many of them children, in a rail yard in a small Tennessee town on a September afternoon. The execution of Mary has been written about many times in the century since it occurred, and the writing almost always contains the same quality of troubled ambivalence, a recognition that the story carries multiple kinds of tragedy simultaneously. The death of a circus trainer is a tragedy, particularly when it is violent and public. But there is also something in the story of Mary herself, in the question of what provoked her, in the conditions of her life as a performing elephant in the early American circus, in the fact that she was hanged before a crowd as though her execution were itself a form of entertainment that resists clean resolution. The question of what Red Eldridge did in the moment before Mary acted is not answerable. The question of what Mary understood, if anything, of the proceedings in that rail yard is not answerable either. What can be said is that she was a large animal who had been trained to perform for human audiences, who reacted with violence on one occasion, and who was executed for it in a manner that drew thousands of spectators. The circus moved on. Irwin, Tennessee, kept the story. It kept it for a long time. The year 1816 is known, in the historical literature, by a name that carries within it a very specific kind of cold: the year without a summer. But the name, for all its evocative accuracy, understates the scale of what happened, which began not in 1816 but in 1815, on an island in what is now Indonesia, at a moment of geological violence so extreme that it reshaped the climate of the entire planet. Mount Tambora, on the island of Sumbawa, was already known as an active volcano in April of 1815. The indigenous population of the region had coexisted with it across generations, as people do with geological features that are simply part of the landscape of their existence. There had been activity in the years before 1815, some eruptions, some ash, some rumbling from the depths, but nothing that prepared anyone for what happened on the evening of April 10th. The eruption of Mount Tambora on April 10th, 1815, is the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. This is not a minor distinction. Krakatoa, which would erupt in 1883 and achieve a kind of cultural immortality, was a smaller event. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington was immeasurably smaller. Tambora released an estimated 160 cubic kilometers of magma, ash, and debris. The explosion was heard more than 2,000 kilometers away. In Sumatra, in Borneo, on islands throughout the region, where people who heard the sound assumed it was cannon fire or earthquakes or some other familiar catastrophe. Anything but what it actually was. The eruption column reached 43 kilometers into the stratosphere, depositing an enormous quantity of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where it would stay and where it would do its damage for years. The immediate human cost was staggering. The indigenous Tambora people, who had lived on the island's slopes, were effectively wiped out. The villages of the Sangar Peninsula were buried under pyroclastic flows. The death toll from the direct eruption, ash, fire, gas, and the collapse of structures was somewhere between 10 and 11,000 people. In the weeks that followed, famine and disease resulting from the destruction of crops and freshwater sources killed an additional estimated 80,000 people on Sumbawa and nearby islands. The region had been, before April 10, 1815, relatively populous. After, it was transformed into a landscape of gray ash and silence. But the eruption's effects did not stay in Indonesia. The sulfur dioxide that Tambora pumped into the stratosphere spread around the globe in the months that followed, forming a reflective veil of aerosols that reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. The effect was gradual, invisible, and global. By the following spring, it was being felt in the Northern Hemisphere. The summer of 1816 was not the absence of summer in any total sense. There were warm days, particularly in some regions. But the cold was wrong. In New England, there were killing frosts in June, July, and August. Crops that had been planted failed. Farmers who had already planted their fields watched their seedlings die. In Vermont, a May snowfall was followed by killing frosts in June and then again in July and August. The Connecticut River froze in late May. In parts of Europe, the situation was as bad or worse. 1816 is remembered in Germany and France and Switzerland as the year of famine and hunger, the year when bread became scarce and prices rose to levels the poor could not meet, the year when social unrest spiked across a continent still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars. The human consequences of the year without a summer are difficult to fully calculate because they unfolded over several years and across multiple continents and interacted with existing political and social instabilities in complex ways. An estimated 90,000 people died in Europe due to famine and famine-related disease between 1816 and 1819. In China, the altered monsoon patterns contributed to flooding and famine. In India, the monsoon failure contributed to a cholera epidemic that eventually spread globally. The total death toll attributable to Tambora's 1815 eruption, if you count the downstream effects through disease and famine over the following years, has been estimated at some 71,000 in the immediate event and possibly 100,000 or 200,000 more in the subsequent years. Some researchers put the full toll higher. And yet from this catastrophe came something that has lasted far longer and in far stranger form than anyone at the time could have imagined. In the summer of 1816, a group of writers and intellectuals, including Percy Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and the poet Lord Byron, were gathered at the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The summer was dark and cold and wet, too miserable for outdoor activity, and the group spent their days indoors discussing philosophy, reading ghost stories, and eventually challenging each other to write horror tales. Mary Godwin, who was 18 years old, wrote the beginnings of what would become Frankenstein. Byron wrote the fragment that would be completed by his physician John Polidori as The Vampire, widely considered the origin point of the literary vampire tradition. The Year Without a Summer, in other words, gave us both Frankenstein and Dracula. The volcanic winter that killed thousands and darkened the northern sky also, in a cold villa in Switzerland, lit the lamp of a particular kind of modern imagination. Whether this is an irony or a compensation or simply a coincidence is something that each reader of this story must decide for themselves. The sulfur dioxide from Tambora's eruption took several years to fully settle out of the stratosphere. The climate returned, gradually, to its previous patterns. The farms that had survived replanted. The rivers unfroze. The sun came back. But the mountain itself, once 3,400 meters tall, had collapsed during the eruption into something much smaller. It had given away more than 1,000 meters of its own height to the sky, distributing itself across the globe in the form of temporary winter. Tambora still stands on Sumbawa today, considerably shorter than it used to be, looking out over an ocean it once covered in ash, quiet now in the particular way of things that have already done the worst they are capable of doing. History is, among other things, a record of the occasions on which human beings have attempted to impose orderly systems on a universe that appears to have no strong investment in orderliness. Elections, democratic elections, with their implicit faith that the governed should participate in their governance, that rational actors will weigh candidates and choose wisely, that the process will produce outcomes that reflect the genuine will of a living electorate, are a particularly ambitious form of this ordering impulse. And occasionally, the universe pushes back. On October 16, 2000, a small plane carrying 3 passengers departed from St. Louis, Missouri, bound for a campaign event in southern Missouri. On board were Randy Carnahan, son of Mel Carnahan, the Democratic candidate for Senate, Chris Sifford, an aide, and Mel Carnahan himself, the 73-year-old governor of Missouri who was engaged in what had become a genuinely competitive race against the Republican incumbent, John Ashcroft. The plane went down near the town of Hillsborough in Jefferson County. All 3 passengers were killed. The election was 18 days away. What followed in those 18 days placed Missouri, and by extension the rest of the country, in a situation for which the existing legal framework had been, to put it generously, imperfectly prepared. Mel Carnahan was on the ballot. Under Missouri law, it was too late to remove his name. And more significantly, it was too late for the Democratic Party to replace him with another candidate. The only options available were to leave his name on the ballot as it stood, or for voters to write in another candidate. A process with its own limitations and uncertainties. Jean Carnahan, Mel's widow, had barely finished the early stages of grief when she was approached with a proposal that was simultaneously an honor and an imposition. The Lieutenant Governor, Roger Wilson, indicated that if Mel Carnahan won the election posthumously, if enough Missouri voters voted for a dead man, he, Wilson, would appoint Jean Carnahan to serve the Senate seat in her husband's place. She agreed. She campaigned. The Democratic Party campaigned on behalf of Mel Carnahan's legacy, arguing that his vision for Missouri deserved to be honored, and that honoring it meant doing the unusual thing of voting for him, even though he would not be there to take the seat. On November 7, 2000, the same night that the rest of the country was becoming consumed by the disputed presidential election in Florida, the hanging chads and butterfly ballots, and the eventual Supreme Court intervention that would define the presidency of the next 4 years, Missouri held its Senate election. And Mel Carnahan, who had been dead for 18 days, defeated John Ashcroft by a margin of approximately 50,000 votes, roughly 50.5% to 48.4%. He became, in that moment, the only person in American history to win a Senate election after his death. The victory was not legally his, of course. Jean Carnahan was appointed to the seat as promised, becoming senator for Missouri. She would go on to serve until 2002, when she ran in her own right and lost to Republican Jim Talent. John Ashcroft would go on to be appointed Attorney General of the United States by President George W. Bush, meaning that his loss to a dead man was, in the longer arc of his career, a temporary setback. But the quality of that particular night, the image of a Missouri Senate race being decided in favor of a candidate who had died 18 days earlier, against the backdrop of the most contested presidential election in modern American history, is not easily categorized. It sits somewhere between the elegiac and the surreal, between the democratic and the impossible. What does it mean to vote for a dead man? In the narrow technical sense, Missouri voters were voting for a symbol, for an idea of governance represented by a person who could no longer govern. They were voting, perhaps, for continuity, for the persistence of a set of values past the life of the person who had articulated them. They were voting against the alternative, and doing so with the particular intensity of people who had watched a man die in the service of a campaign and felt that his death had not closed the question his campaign had been asking. Mel Carnahan's grave is in a small Missouri town. Jean Carnahan is still alive as of this writing. John Ashcroft has written memoirs. The planes still fly from St. Louis on October evenings, their lights blinking slowly over the same dark Missouri landscape that swallowed that small aircraft in 2000, and the passengers on them, traveling toward their ordinary destinations, know nothing of what happened below. The universe, as has been observed, has no strong investment in orderliness. But occasionally, not always, not reliably, not in any pattern that bears close inspection, it produces outcomes that feel less like randomness and more like statement. A man runs for Senate. He dies. His name stays on the ballot. And enough people, for enough reasons, vote for him anyway that he wins. Whether that is democracy at its most adaptive, or grief at its most politically expressed, or simply the universe doing what it occasionally does, producing the impossible result, the one that no system was designed to accommodate, the one that the history books will carry forward exactly as it happened, unembellished and unexaggerated, is not a question that has a clean answer. The Cadaver Synod is, by almost any measure, the most macabre legal proceeding in the history of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has, across its 15 centuries of institutional existence, generated a number of proceedings that test the boundaries of that description. But none of them approach what took place in a cold basilica in Rome in the January of 897, when a pope was placed on trial for crimes he was alleged to have committed during his pontificate. The fact that the accused had been dead for 7 months did not prevent the trial from proceeding. It did not prevent the verdict from being delivered, and it did not prevent the punishment from being carried out. To understand the Cadaver Synod, and it deserves to be understood rather than merely gawked at, you have to understand the particular fever of 9th century papal politics, which were conducted with a brutality and a speed that make modern political scandal look decorous by comparison. The papacy in the late 9th century was not the slow-moving, ceremonially insulated institution it would later become. It was contested, violent, and frequently lethal. Popes rose and fell with alarming regularity. Alliances shifted. The great Italian families who surrounded Rome and who understood that control of the papacy meant influence over the most powerful spiritual institution in the Western world played their games with the papacy as their primary instrument, and they played those games without sentimentality. Pope Formosus had been elected in 891 and had served until his death in April of 896. His papacy was complicated. He had navigated the turbulent waters of late 9th century Roman politics with varying success, had made enemies, had made friends, and had, like most of his contemporaries in positions of institutional power, made decisions that were simultaneously principled and self-interested. He died, apparently of natural causes, and was buried with the honors appropriate to his office in St. Peter's Basilica. Then Pope Stephen VI came to power. Stephen's relationship with the memory of Formosus was not cordial. The precise nature of his grievances has been debated for over 1,000 years, and the full truth is probably irretrievable at this distance. What is recoverable is what he did. In January of 897, Stephen VI ordered that the corpse of his predecessor be exhumed from its tomb, dressed in the vestments appropriate to a pope, and brought into the courtroom of the Lateran Palace to stand trial. The body of Formosus, at this point 7 or 8 months dead, was placed in a chair. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the deceased, an assignment that must have been, even by the standards of 9th century Rome, a deeply uncomfortable commission. Pope Stephen VI presided, and the charges were read aloud to a dead man seated in papal robes in a room full of the living. The charges against Formosus were primarily ecclesiastical and political in nature. He was accused of perjury. He was accused of having illegally assumed the bishopric of Rome while already serving as bishop of another diocese, a canonical violation. He was accused of having allied with enemies of the papacy in ways that had damaged the institution. Stephen, by contemporary accounts, did not confine himself to legal proceedings in the formal sense. He screamed at the corpse. He raged. He turned to address the dead man's face directly, demanding answers, demanding justification, demanding the kinds of explanations that a living defendant would have been required to provide and that a dead one was obviously unable to give. The appointed deacon answered on Formosus's behalf, as quietly and cautiously as a man speaking for a corpse in front of a furious pope could manage. The verdict was, of course, guilty. The punishment was carried out immediately. The vestments were stripped from the body of Formosus. The 3 fingers of his right hand that had been used in consecrations, the fingers of blessing, in the tradition of papal ceremony, were cut off. The body was dressed in the clothing of a layman and thrown first into a common grave, then later, after someone decided even this was insufficient, thrown into the Tiber River. The spectacle of the Cadaver Synod was too much even for the rough standards of 9th century Rome. The popular reaction to what Stephen had done was immediate and violent. A revolt broke out. Stephen VI was seized, stripped of his papal vestments, thrown into a dungeon, and strangled before the year was out. The body of Formosus was eventually recovered from the Tiber by monks who reportedly still venerated him, and he was reinterred in St. Peter's with the honors of his office restored. Several subsequent popes declared the proceedings of the cadaver synod null and void. The synod was formally annulled. The decisions Stephen had made, the verdict he had reached, the punishment he had inflicted, all of it was erased, at least in the official record. But you cannot unhappen a thing. You cannot make the memory of it go away, no matter how many official documents declare it void. The cadaver synod is still there in the history of the Church, indelible and strange. The record of a moment when institutional fury and personal hatred combined to produce something so far outside the boundaries of ordinary political life that it has never, in 11 centuries, found a satisfying category. What does it tell us? Perhaps only this, that the dead are not always as safe from the passions of the living as we might reasonably hope, that the need to win an argument, to be right, to be vindicated, to defeat an enemy even when that enemy no longer exists to be defeated, can drive human beings to extraordinary lengths. Stephen VI apparently needed Formosus to be found guilty so badly that the minor obstacle of Formosus's death was insufficient to stop the proceeding. He got his verdict, and then the city took him apart for it. The balance sheet of the cadaver synod is, in the end, almost perfectly symmetrical. One dead pope tried and convicted, one living pope strangled in a dungeon within the year. Justice, in the 9th century, had a certain rough-hewn efficiency about it. From Rome in the 9th century, we travel backward, much further backward, to a story that requires us to stand at the foot of the Alps in the autumn of 218 BCE and imagine something that the Roman generals waiting on the Italian side of those mountains considered, until they saw it with their own eyes, simply impossible. The story of Hannibal Barca crossing the Alps with his army is one of the great military feats of the ancient world, and it has been celebrated as such for more than 2,000 years. But the celebrations, which tend to focus on the audacity and scale of the achievement, sometimes smooth over the texture of the thing, the cold, the exhaustion, the suffering, the animals, and the very particular quality of an undertaking that everyone involved, including perhaps Hannibal himself, must have understood was as likely to kill them as to succeed. Hannibal was the son of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general who had fought Rome to a standstill in the First Punic War and who had spent the rest of his life building a Carthaginian empire in the Iberian Peninsula and nursing a hatred for Rome that he transmitted to his sons with the deliberateness of a careful educator. There is a story, repeated by several ancient sources with enough consistency to suggest it may contain some truth, that when Hannibal was a small boy of 9, he begged his father to be allowed to accompany him on a military expedition to Spain. Hamilcar agreed, but first made the boy swear a solemn oath of enmity toward Rome at the family altar. Hannibal swore. He never forgot the oath. He would spend his entire adult life attempting to honor it. By 218 BCE, Hannibal was in his late 20s and in command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain. He had made a decision, one of the most strategically ambitious decisions in military history, that he would attack Rome not by sea, where the Romans had rebuilt their naval superiority after the First Punic War, but by land, by a land route that passed through southern Gaul and over the Alps. He would bring the war to Italy itself, to the ground the Romans considered inviolable, and he would do this with an army of somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 men. The numbers in the ancient sources vary enormously, and with 37 war elephants. The war elephants are the detail that lodges most firmly in the imagination, and they deserve to be thought about carefully. These were not the small forest elephants of West Africa. They were North African elephants, a subspecies that is now extinct, somewhat smaller than the elephants of the sub-Saharan African savanna, but still enormous by the standard of anything that would be expected to navigate alpine passes in the autumn. Each elephant carried a tower on its back containing soldiers. Each elephant had been trained for warfare, trained to charge lines of infantry, trained to respond to commands, trained to the sounds of battle. They were simultaneously weapons, symbols, and logistical nightmares, and Hannibal brought 37 of them over the Alps. The march began in the early autumn. The crossing of the Rhone River in southern Gaul was itself a considerable undertaking. The elephants were floated across on large rafts, an operation that required a combination of engineering ingenuity and the understanding that an alarmed elephant on a raft is a problem of significant magnitude. Most of them crossed without serious incident. The army moved east and then north into the foothills and then upward into the Alps themselves. The Alps in late autumn are a particular kind of hostile. The passes that would have been available to Hannibal, historians have debated for centuries which specific pass he used, with candidates including the Col du Mont Cenis, the Col du Clapier, and others, sit above 2,000 meters. The temperature drops below freezing. Snow accumulates on paths that were not designed for armies. The trails are narrow, the drops beside them severe, and the rock itself, when cold enough, becomes something that even trained soldiers with good equipment struggle to negotiate. Hannibal's army was not in good condition when it reached the high passes. They had been marching for weeks. They had fought skirmishes with hostile Gallic tribes along the way. They were cold, hungry, and in the particular psychological state of men who have gone far enough forward that going back is no longer obviously better than going forward. The Gauls in the high passes, local tribes who saw the army as an opportunity for plunder, attacked from above, rolling rocks down onto the column, picking off stragglers, creating a noise and confusion that the animals found extremely distressing. The elephants, to Hannibal's credit and possibly to the elephants' own credit, held together better than might have been expected. Their size made them difficult to dislodge from narrow paths. Their presence seems to have unnerved the attacking Gauls enough to limit some of the harassment. But the descent on the Italian side, which the ancient historian Polybius describes in some detail, was treacherous in ways that the ascent had not prepared anyone for. There was ice. There were paths that had been made impassable by landslides. There is a famous passage in Polybius describing how Hannibal's engineers used fire and vinegar to crack large rocks that were blocking the route, heating the stone with fire, then pouring vinegar over it to cause the thermal shock that would split it. Whether this technique was as effective as described has been debated by modern historians, but the description itself speaks to the scale of the obstacles. They were large enough to require geological intervention. It took 15 days to cross the Alps. Hannibal lost an unknown but significant number of men to the crossing, to cold, to falls, to Gallic attacks, to exhaustion and disease. When he descended into the Pi Valley of northern Italy and allowed his men to rest, he was working with a considerably reduced force. Estimates of his losses during the crossing range widely, but he arrived in Italy with perhaps half the men he had started with. And then, remarkably, he won. Not immediately and not permanently, but the campaigns that followed, the battles of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and above all Cannae, where in 216 BCE Hannibal engineered one of the most devastating tactical defeats in Roman military history, killing somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers in a single day, demonstrated that the crossing had accomplished its strategic purpose. Hannibal had brought the war to Italy. He had proved that Rome was not invulnerable on its own soil. He would never take Rome itself. The siege he never mounted, the city he circled but never entered. This is another famous dimension of the Hannibal story, and it has its own explanations. But here, in the consideration of the crossing itself, what is worth holding on to is the image of those 37 elephants navigating mountain paths above 2,000 meters in the late autumn cold, their breath visible in the thin air, their enormous bodies moving with the careful, deliberate gait of creatures that understood, at some level, that the ground beneath them was not reliable. They were instruments of war being carried through one of the most unwarlike environments on Earth, and most of them made it. Most of them came down from the Alps alive, into the green Italian plain, and stood ready for whatever Hannibal asked of them next. One of them, reportedly, was ridden by Hannibal himself, an elephant named Surus, described as larger than the others, perhaps a Syrian elephant rather than a North African one. Surus carried Hannibal through the Alps and into Italy. Surus carried him through the early campaigns. And then, eventually, Surus died. In the winter following the crossing, possibly. And Hannibal continued the Italian campaign, 16 years in total, on foot. The Alps, of course, are still there. The passes are still there. And sometimes, in the late autumn, when the cold comes down from the peaks and the light changes to that flat, gray quality that high mountains take on when winter approaches, it is possible to stand at a certain elevation and hear, if you are listening for it, something that might be the wind or might be the echo of something older, the sound of an army that has come too far to turn back, moving through the cold with everything it has, toward a war it cannot yet know how it will end. There is a particular way that mornings begin in the shadow of a volcano that is not yet fully awake. The air has a quality that people living nearby learn to read. A certain sulfurous edge, a heaviness in the atmosphere, a vibration in the ground that is too low to be heard but can be felt in the soles of the feet and in the back of the jaw. Whether the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum read these signs in the days before August 24th, 79 CE, is something we will never know. What we know is that they did not leave. Or rather, not enough of them left. Pompeii in the late summer of 79 CE was a prosperous Roman city of somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 inhabitants. Estimates vary, as they always do for ancient populations, situated on the Bay of Naples in the Campania region of southern Italy. It was a commercial city, a port city, a city of bakers and wine merchants and fishermen and wealthy Romans who had built elaborate villas along the bay to take advantage of the climate and the view. It had a forum, an amphitheater, bathhouses, temples, brothels, and the entire dense social infrastructure of Roman urban life. It had been shaken by a significant earthquake in 62 CE, an earthquake that had caused substantial damage and that modern geologists now understand was almost certainly related to the magmatic activity building beneath Vesuvius. And the city had, in the 17 years between that earthquake and 79 CE, been substantially repaired and rebuilt. The scars of the earthquake had been covered over. Life had resumed. Vesuvius itself, visible from anywhere in the city, was not understood to be what it was. The Romans had some concept of volcanic mountains. The eruptions of Sicily's Mount Etna were well documented, but Vesuvius had not erupted in recorded memory, and the mountain slopes were green and densely planted with vineyards that produced wine of apparently excellent quality. What was experienced from time to time as peculiar ground tremors and occasional gas venting was not connected, in the Roman understanding, to any imminent danger. The mountain was a landmark, a backdrop, a feature of the landscape that had always been there and was expected to always remain. The eruption of Vesuvius on August 24, 79 CE. Some recent research suggests the date may have been in October, based on evidence from the archaeological record, though the traditional date remains widely cited, began in the early afternoon. The initial eruption column, composed of ash, pumice, and volcanic gases, rose to a height of perhaps 20 to 30 kilometers above the mountain's summit. The column was visible from an enormous distance. It is described in a famous letter by Pliny the Younger, who was 17 years old at the time and was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, at Misenum on the far side of the Bay of Naples. Pliny the Younger's letters, written to the historian Tacitus years after the event, but with enough specific detail to suggest careful memory or contemporaneous notes, are the most vivid eyewitness account of the eruption that survives, and they are extraordinary documents. He describes the cloud above Vesuvius as resembling a pine tree, a tall column rising and then spreading into branches at the top, a shape that volcanologists now recognize as the characteristic form of a Plinian eruption column. He describes the sea withdrawing from the shore as though sucked back by the earth, the phenomenon now recognized as the ocean being drawn away before a tsunami, or as the result of atmospheric pressure changes associated with the eruption. He describes darkness that came not gradually but suddenly, a darkness, he writes, different from a moonless or cloudy night, the kind of darkness that occurs when a light is extinguished in a closed room. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, took a ship across the bay to attempt a rescue of friends stranded near the eruption and to observe the phenomenon more closely. He got closer than was wise. The falling ash and the gases made it impossible to advance further by sea. He put in at Stabii, a few kilometers south of Pompeii, and spent the night there while the eruption continued. In the morning, he attempted to leave and collapsed on the beach. Whether he died from the toxic gases, from a heart attack triggered by the extreme physical stress of the situation, or from some combination, is not certain. He was found dead on the beach after his companions had fled. He was 55 years old, and he was the most prolific natural scientist in the Roman world, and he died watching the volcano he had come to study. In Pompeii itself, the sequence of events that led to the city's preservation, which is a strange word for burial under 5 meters of volcanic material, but preservation is ultimately what it was, involved several phases. The first was the rain of pumice from the eruption column, which fell on Pompeii for hours, accumulating on roofs and streets, collapsing buildings under the weight, filling the spaces between structures with gray-white debris. Many people died in this phase, crushed by roof collapses, or buried where they sheltered while trying to wait out what they hoped was a temporary storm of ash. Others attempted to flee and were caught in the open. Then, in the early hours of August 25th, the eruption entered a new phase. The column, which had been sustained by the eruption's energy, collapsed. When an eruption column collapses, the material in it, the ash and gas and burning rock that had been held aloft, falls back toward the mountain and spreads outward as a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving current of superheated gas and ash that travels at speeds of up to several hundred kilometers per hour and reaches temperatures of several hundred degrees Celsius. The first surge, and the ones that followed it in rapid succession over the next hours, reached Herculaneum first, destroying that city almost instantly, and then reached Pompeii. The people of Pompeii who died in the surges did not die slowly. The heat was sufficient to cause near-instantaneous death. The ash that followed settled over the bodies, encasing them in the volcanic material that hardened around them over centuries. When archaeologists in the 19th century encountered cavities in the hardened ash, negative spaces in the shape of human beings, they had the insight to fill them with plaster. What emerged from those plaster casts was something that has haunted everyone who has encountered it since: the exact shapes of people in their last moments. A man covering his face. A woman curled with a child held against her. A dog twisted against its chain. A group of people huddled together in a room that offered no protection. These are not reconstructions or artists' interpretations. They are the literal shapes of people who lived in the 1st century CE, preserved in the moment of their deaths with a fidelity that no monument or tomb could have achieved. Pompeii is, among other things, one of the most intimate encounters with the ancient past that any living person can have, not because of its mosaics or its wall paintings or its remarkably preserved bread ovens and wine bars and political graffiti, though all of these are extraordinary, but because of those casts, because of the people inside them. The eruption killed somewhere between 2,000 and 16,000 people in Pompeii and Herculaneum combined. The numbers are still debated, because the archaeology can only tell us about the people who stayed, and an unknown number had fled before the worst phases of the eruption. The cities were not rediscovered in any meaningful sense until the 18th century, when excavations began to reveal the extent of what the volcanic deposits had preserved. The excavations have been ongoing, in various forms, for nearly 300 years. They are still ongoing. There are portions of Pompeii that have not yet been fully excavated. Vesuvius, visible from the ruins of Pompeii on any clear day, is still an active volcano. It is classified as one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, partly because of its eruptive history and partly because approximately 3 million people now live within its potential impact zone, more than lived in all of Roman Campania in 79 CE. The last major eruption was in 1944. There are evacuation plans. There are monitoring systems. And there is, for anyone standing in the ruins of Pompeii and looking up at the mountain on the horizon, a quality of awareness that the ancient Romans did not have, and that we do, and that does not entirely comfort. If Pompeii gives us an image of human civilization at its most ordinary and its most vulnerable, bread rising in ovens, graffiti drying on walls, children sleeping while the mountain woke, then the reign of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history by his childhood nickname Caligula, gives us something rather different. An image of what happens when absolute power is placed in the hands of someone whose relationship with ordinary human norms is, to say the least, creative. Caligula became emperor of Rome in 37 CE following the death of his predecessor Tiberius, and his accession was greeted with widespread and genuine relief. Tiberius had been, by his final years, a figure of terror, withdrawn, suspicious, and responsible for a period of political violence that had left the senatorial class in a state of exhausted anxiety. Caligula, who was 24 years old and had the advantage of a popular family name, was welcomed as a new beginning. The people of Rome celebrated. The Senate cooperated. For a few months, everything seemed to be going well. And then, and here the ancient sources agree, though they agree on little else about the specifics, something changed. Caligula fell seriously ill in late 37 CE. He recovered, but by most accounts, the man who recovered was not entirely the man who had become ill. Whether his illness caused some kind of neurological change, whether he had always been what he now became and had simply been constrained by the need to perform normalcy before he was fully in power, or whether the ancient sources that describe his behavior are exaggerating for effect. All of these are questions that scholars have debated without resolution. What is recoverable is the behavior itself, or at least the behavior that was recorded. Among the things attributed to Caligula during his 4-year reign, the sexual violations, the political murders, the theatrical performances in which he played a god, the bridges built across the Bay of Baiae for no apparent purpose other than to prove he could, the declarations of war against Neptune. One story has achieved a particular resonance because it combines the genuinely bizarre with a layer of possible political sophistication that makes it more interesting than simple madness. The horse's name was Incitatus. Incitatus was Caligula's favorite racehorse, and the emperor's affection for the animal was, by contemporary accounts, extraordinary. The horse was housed in a stable of marble. The horse had an ivory manger. The horse was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. The horse had a household staff. The horse received guests, senators and dignitaries who came to the horse's quarters for dinners at which they were served food and wine and presumably expected to treat the occasion with the gravity that an invitation from the emperor demanded. And then there is the claim, made by the Roman historian Suetonius, writing several decades after Caligula's death, that Caligula intended to make Incitatus a consul, one of the two highest magistrates in the Roman government. Some sources extend this to say that Incitatus was actually made a priest or was actually appointed to some official position. The consul claim has been the one that has lodged most firmly in the historical imagination, for reasons that are obvious. The image of a horse serving in the Roman government is spectacular in its absurdity. But historians have increasingly moved toward the interpretation that the story, whatever its factual basis, was not simply evidence of Caligula's mental instability. It was a political statement, and a rather pointed one. The Senate, in this reading, was the target of the joke. By threatening to appoint a horse to the consulship, or by actually appointing a horse to some lesser office, Caligula was not expressing his sincere belief that horses were capable of governance. He was expressing his contempt for the institution he was supposedly working with, demonstrating that the consulship, which the senators valued as the pinnacle of their political achievements, was worth so little in his estimation that he could give it to an animal and the government would function no differently than it had before. Whether Caligula was mad or calculating, or some combination of the two that resists clean separation is a question the sources cannot fully answer. He was assassinated in January of 41 CE by members of his own Praetorian Guard, after a reign of approximately 3 years and 10 months. He was 28 years old. The conspirators reportedly stabbed him 30 times, in a pattern that would be repeated on the steps of the Senate in 44 BCE by a much larger group with a more famous victim, suggesting that something about the number 30 in the act of organized stabbing had a persistent appeal in Roman political culture. Incitatus, for his part, presumably continued to eat his gold-flaked oats and receive his visitors and stand in his marble stable after his patron's death. We do not know what happened to him in the end. He passed out of the historical record as quietly as he had passed into it loudly. A horse who had been, for a few years, the most famous animal in the world, used by a mad emperor to mock the most powerful institution in Rome, and who was entirely unaware of any of it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a place where people were and then weren't. Not the silence of a cemetery, which is deliberately maintained, or the silence of an abandoned house, which is accidental, but the specific silence of a place where people made a life and then vanished from it, leaving behind only the evidence of their presence, objects, structures, traces, and none of the explanation. The Roanoke colony has been generating that silence for more than 400 years. In 1587, a group of approximately 115 English colonists arrived on Roanoke Island, a long, narrow strip of land on the coast of what is now North Carolina, between the Outer Banks and the mainland. They were not the first English people to try to establish a foothold in this part of North America. There had been an earlier attempt, in 1585 and 1586, which had ended badly enough that the colonists had been evacuated back to England. The 1587 group was meant to be a more permanent settlement, better supplied, better organized, with families rather than the primarily military group that had come before. The colonists arrived in July and almost immediately encountered the difficulty that would define their entire experience. The relationship with the local Algonquian-speaking peoples was unstable and, in some cases, openly hostile. The earlier English expeditions had done damage. They had burned native villages, destroyed food stores, and generally established a template of interaction that the 1587 colonists were inheriting without having created it. The situation was tense from the beginning. Their leader, John White, was a cartographer and artist who had been part of the earlier expeditions and who had, among his other distinctions, produced some of the most detailed and beautiful illustrations of the coastal Carolina environment and its indigenous people that survived from the 16th century. White was also the grandfather of Virginia Dare, who was born in the colony on August 18, 1587, and became the first English child born in the Americas. Virginia Dare has been a figure of considerable symbolic weight in American history ever since, an emblem of the colonial project's earliest and most uncertain attempts to establish itself. John White returned to England in late 1587 to arrange for resupply. What happened next was not his fault, and it was not anyone's plan. The Spanish Armada crisis of 1588, the famous attempted invasion of England by the Spanish fleet, which was defeated partly by English naval action and partly by catastrophic storms, consumed every available English ship and sailor for several years. White could not get back to Roanoke. He tried. He was turned back. He found partial passage on an expedition that had different priorities. He was delayed, repeatedly, by the demands of a war that was reshaping European geopolitics with complete indifference to the fate of 115 colonists on an island in North America. White finally returned to Roanoke in August of 1590. He had been away for 3 years. What he found when he arrived at the site of the settlement was the subject of the first great mystery in American colonial history. The settlement was abandoned. The structures were gone, not burned, not destroyed in an obvious act of violence, but dismantled. The palisade fence that surrounded the settlement had been taken apart. The houses were gone. The possessions the colonists had left behind when White sailed for England, the chests and furniture and other heavy items they could not take with them on a potentially temporary relocation, had been buried, and the burying site showed signs of having been disturbed and looted, though by whom was not clear. The colonists themselves were nowhere. On one of the posts of the fort, carved into the wood with obvious deliberateness, were the letters CRO. On a tree at the entrance to the palisade, more completely, the word Croton was carved. This was the name of a neighboring island to the south, and also the name of a native people associated with that island. And the carving was consistent with an arrangement that White had made before his departure. If the colonists needed to relocate, they were to carve their destination into a tree, and if they left under circumstances of duress or danger, they were to add a cross above the carving. There was no cross. This suggested, to White, that the colonists had left voluntarily to join the Croton people on Croton Island. He attempted to sail south to search for them, but a combination of bad weather and the practical difficulties of navigation in the shallow sounds of coastal Carolina forced him back. He never made it to Croton Island. He returned to England. He never saw the colony again. He never found his granddaughter Virginia Dare, who would have been 3 years old when he returned to find the settlement empty. What happened to the colonists of Roanoke is one of the most debated questions in early American history, and it has attracted an enormous range of proposed explanations over 4 centuries. The most widely accepted modern theory is that the colonists integrated into the Croatan people, that they moved south to Croton Island and lived among its inhabitants, gradually assimilating. There is some genetic and archaeological evidence that is consistent with this theory, though not definitive. Other theories have proposed death by disease, death at the hands of hostile indigenous groups, death from Spanish attack, and various combinations of the above. None of the theories have been proven. None of them have been ruled out. The colonists of Roanoke left only their carved word, Croton, as a message to the future, and the future, for all its subsequent centuries of searching, has not managed to decode it with any certainty. Virginia Dare, if she survived the colony's first years, would have grown up knowing two cultures, two languages, two ways of understanding the world. Whether she survived at all is unknown. Whether she had children who carried English and Algonquian blood into the generations that followed is unknown. She exists in history as a name, a date of birth, and a question, perhaps the first American question, in the sense of being the first question that the European presence in North America generated that has never been answered. The island of Roanoke is still there. The Sound is still there. The Outer Banks are still there, long and sandy and shaped by the winds that come off the Atlantic. And somewhere in that landscape, on the island, on Croton Island, in the genetic record of families who have lived in that region for generations, there may be an answer that has been there all along, waiting for someone to recognize it. From the New World's first great disappearance, we turn now to an episode that is less remembered than it should be. Set in a city at the very edge of Europe's relationship with Asia, in a moment when the modern world was colliding with something much older in ways that produced, among other things, one of the stranger municipal decisions in the history of urban administration. Constantinople in 1910 was a city in transformation, or rather, a city that was the capital of an empire in transformation, which is a more complicated and more painful thing. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the city since 1453 when Mehmed II had breached the walls that had kept the city Byzantine for 1,000 years, was in the late stages of what historians now call its long decline. Though of course from inside a declining empire the decline does not announce itself as such. There were political upheavals, reforms attempted and abandoned, the Young Turks and their revolution of 1908, and beneath all of this the daily complexity of a city of hundreds of thousands of people from dozens of ethnic and religious backgrounds trying to live in the same urban space. And then there were the dogs. Constantinople's street dogs were not a new phenomenon. They had been present in the city for centuries. Enormous, rough-coated animals, descended from ancient pastoral breeds, who had organized themselves into territorial packs that each controlled specific neighborhoods with remarkable precision and stability. Different districts had their own dog populations. The dogs of one quarter did not trespass into the territory of another without consequences. Within their territories, the dogs performed a kind of ecological service that the city had come to depend on. They consumed waste. Ottoman Constantinople had no modern sewage system, no regular garbage collection, and the dogs functioned as the primary mechanism for disposing of organic waste in the streets. They were not pets. They were not domesticated in any meaningful sense. They were a wild population that occupied urban space, and they had been there so long that they had become, in a peculiar way, part of the city's identity. The estimates of Constantinople's street dog population in the early 20th century vary widely, but numbers in the range of 80,000 are cited with some frequency. 80,000 dogs in a city of considerably less than 1 million people is a significant ratio. The dogs were loud. They were sometimes aggressive. They were a source of rabies, which in the pre-vaccination era was essentially always fatal and was accordingly a major public health concern. They occupied the center of city streets, and the accounts of travelers to Constantinople in the 19th century almost uniformly include some commentary on the dogs, their noise at night, their omnipresence, their strange and specific territorial organization. Western modernization, which was arriving in Constantinople along with everything else in the early 20th century, looked at 80,000 street dogs and saw a problem to be solved. The new administration, influenced by European models of municipal hygiene, decided that the dogs had to go. In 1910, the Ottoman government rounded up the street dogs of Constantinople, tens of thousands of them, loaded them onto boats, and transported them to Sivriata, a small and uninhabited island in the Sea of Marmara. The island had no fresh water. The island had no food source beyond whatever the dogs could find, which was nothing. The dogs were, in the language of the administrative decision, being relocated. What they were being relocated to was starvation. The sounds carried across the water to Constantinople in the days and weeks that followed. The howling was audible from the city's shores. People who lived along the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara heard it. A continuous, collective sound of distress that went on for weeks as the animals on the island died of dehydration and hunger. The boats that passed Sivriata reportedly gave it a wide distance. The island acquired a name in colloquial usage that reflected what it had become. The public reaction was complex. There were people in Constantinople who were relieved to have the streets cleared. There were others, and this is documented, who were disturbed by what they had done, who felt that the means of the removal had been wrong even if the ends were defensible. There are accounts of subsequent bad fortune in the city, earthquakes, floods, fires, that were attributed by some residents to the decision about the dogs, in the way that superstitious causality often attaches itself to collective acts that sit uneasily on the conscience. Whether the dogs of Sivriata represent a particularly dark chapter in the history of urban management, or whether they are a story about the violence of modernization applied to populations, human or animal, that do not fit the new administrative categories, is a question that the story itself does not answer. What it offers instead is the image: an island in the Sea of Marmara in the summer of 1910, the sounds coming across the water, and the city that created the situation listening from its shores. The street dogs of Istanbul, as Constantinople became Istanbul after 1930, returned eventually. Their descendants are there today. The city now feeds them, tags them, vaccinates them, and tolerates their presence with an ambivalence that is perhaps the most honest response to a situation that has no fully satisfactory resolution. They are still there, in their specific territories, in the specific doorways and squares they have chosen, looking with their characteristic directness at the people who pass by. They have outlasted the empire that tried to remove them. They have outlasted, for that matter, several governments and several eras of urban planning philosophy, and they will probably outlast several more. The island of Martinique in the French Caribbean had, by the spring of 1902, been living for some time with the knowledge that Mount Pelee, the volcano that dominated the island's northern end, was doing something. The mountain had been showing signs of activity since February: small eruptions, ash falls, the emission of sulfurous gases that drifted down into the valleys and along the coastal roads and into the town of Saint-Pierre, the largest city on the island, which sat at the foot of the mountain approximately 8 kilometers from the summit. Saint-Pierre was extraordinary. In 1902, it was the cultural and commercial capital of the French Caribbean, the Paris of the Antilles, people called it, and the name was not entirely self-congratulatory. The city had a cathedral, a theater, a cable car system, gas lighting, a bustling harbor full of ships from France and the Americas and the wider Atlantic world. Its streets were narrow and crowded and loud with the commerce of a prosperous port city. Its population was somewhere around 26,000 people, and its character was that particular colonial Caribbean mixture of French metropolitan culture and deep Afro-Caribbean tradition that produced, in architecture and cuisine and music and social life, something that was neither purely one nor the other, but distinctly itself. As March of 1902 moved into April, and April into May, the signs from Mount Pelee became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The ash falls were heavier. A lahar, a volcanic mud flow, had killed some 40 people in late April, destroying a distillery on the mountain slopes. Animals were dying. The blistering heat from fumaroles was killing birds and insects on the upper slopes, and the snakes of Martinique, the deadly fer-de-lance, one of the most dangerous pit vipers in the Americas, were being driven down from the mountain by the heat and the gases, flooding into the lower valleys and into the outskirts of Saint-Pierre in numbers that caused a separate crisis. 50 people died from snakebite in the weeks before the eruption. 4,000 animals died. The harbor of Saint-Pierre became thick with dead fish, killed by the heated and chemically altered water. People began to leave. Some people, the wealthy, who had the means and the social permission to go. Some of the middle class. A number of the foreign nationals who lived in the city. But the majority of Saint-Pierre's residents stayed, for reasons that are not difficult to understand. They had businesses, homes, lives rooted in the city. The volcano had been doing something for months without doing the worst thing. There was, as there always is in the approach to catastrophe, a kind of habituation. The alarm systems of daily life recalibrating toward the new normal, finding a way to continue functioning in the presence of danger because the alternative, which was to stop everything and flee, was not something that the structure of ordinary life easily accommodated. There was also politics. The gubernatorial election on the island was scheduled for May 11, 1902. The governor, Louis Moudet, was concerned that if he ordered an evacuation of Saint Pierre, it would disrupt the election and, perhaps more importantly, would be politically embarrassing if the evacuation proved unnecessary and the volcano settled back down. He established a scientific commission to evaluate the danger. The commission's report, issued in the days just before the eruption, assessed the situation as serious but not immediately threatening and did not recommend evacuation. On the morning of May 8, 1902, at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Mount Pelee erupted with a force that had not been anticipated. The eruption produced what is now called a pyroclastic surge, a dense, superheated current of gas and volcanic material that moved outward from the mountain at speeds estimated at over 160 kilometers per hour. It did not follow the path that a lava flow would follow, seeking valleys and channels. It moved outward in a directed blast that covered the 8 kilometers between the mountain and Saint Pierre in under 2 minutes. And what it did to the city when it arrived is almost beyond description and yet has been described, by the small number of people who survived it, with a specificity that makes the account both more credible and more terrible. The temperature of the surge when it reached Saint Pierre was somewhere between 300 and 700 degrees Celsius. Wood, clothing, and human tissue ignited instantly. The physical pressure of the blast wave was sufficient to demolish stone buildings and to hurl large objects, casks, anchors, sections of buildings, through the air with tremendous force. The harbor, where a number of ships were at anchor, was struck by the surge as well. All but one of the ships in the harbor were destroyed, either by the heat and pressure of the surge itself or by the tsunami generated by the eruption. In Saint Pierre, 26,000 people died within 2 minutes. The figure is not metaphorical. The city's entire population, essentially, died in the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. They died where they stood, where they sat, where they slept late on a Thursday morning. They died in the cathedral, and in the marketplace, and in the theater, and in the narrow streets. They died in the harbor. They died on the mountain road, trying to flee. The fire that followed the surge burned for days. There were 2 widely cited survivors in the city itself. The numbers vary slightly in different accounts, but 2 individuals whose survival has been documented and who became, in different ways, emblems of the disaster. One was a cobbler named Léon Comperleandre, who had been in his house on the outskirts of the city and was badly burned but alive. The other was a prisoner named Louis Auguste Cyperus, who had been locked in a stone cell in the city's dungeon, a small, poorly ventilated underground space that the surge's temperatures and pressures somehow failed to fully penetrate. He was badly burned and remained locked in his cell for days after the disaster until rescuers arrived. He later, with a certain theatrical appropriateness, worked for the Barnum and Bailey Circus as a sideshow attraction, billed as the man who had survived the destruction of Saint Pierre and displaying his burn scars as evidence. The city of Saint Pierre was never fully rebuilt. The ruins of the 1902 city are still visible, overgrown and partially excavated, alongside the smaller modern city that eventually grew in part of the original footprint. The rusting hull of one of the ships destroyed in the harbor is a diving site visited by tourists. Mount Pelee is still there, still classified as active, still monitored, still capable of doing what it did in 1902, though the populations near it are now far better equipped with the knowledge of what proximity to an active stratovolcano can mean on a quiet May morning. The governor who refused to order the evacuation, Louis Moutet, died in the eruption along with everyone else. His political calculation, the election, the embarrassment of an unnecessary evacuation, was rendered moot by the mountain's timeline, which had no interest in the electoral calendar of Martinique. There are figures in history who become, over time, something more than the sum of their actual documented lives. They become myths. They become symbols. They become repositories for all the cultural anxieties and fascinations of their era, and then of every subsequent era that encounters them. Grigory Rasputin is one of those figures, and separating the myth from the man has been one of the more persistent projects of Russian historical scholarship for over a century. What we know, Rasputin was born in 1869 in a village in Siberia, the son of a peasant farmer. He grew up in circumstances that were not unusual for rural Siberian peasantry: hard, cold, close to subsistence, saturated with the intense religiosity that characterized Russian Orthodox folk culture in the 19th century. At some point in his young adulthood, he underwent a religious transformation, became a wandering pilgrim, and developed a reputation as a healer and holy man that spread gradually from his home region toward the centers of power in St. Petersburg. He was not a priest. He was not an ordained religious figure of any kind. He was something outside the formal categories, a startse, a holy wanderer, in the Russian tradition, a figure whose spiritual authority came from perceived direct experience of the divine rather than from institutional credentials. His entry into the world of the Romanov royal family came through the most painful door available, the illness of Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei was the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, and he suffered from hemophilia, the bleeding disorder that was, in the early 20th century before the development of blood transfusion and clotting factor treatments, essentially a slow sentence of death by 1,000 small injuries. Every bruise, every cut, every fall could become a crisis that went on for days. The boy suffered constantly. His mother, Alexandra, was consumed by the need to protect him and by the guilt that any parent in her situation would have felt, amplified by the specific torture of royal hemophilia. Knowing that she was the carrier, that she had transmitted this disease to her son, the son on whom the entire dynastic future of Russia depended. Rasputin was brought to the palace in 1905 and, by multiple accounts, demonstrated an ability to calm Alexei's bleeding episodes that no conventional medical treatment of the time could match. The exact mechanism of this has been debated. Hypnosis, the reduction of anxiety and thereby of blood pressure, the cessation of aspirin that court physicians were administering, which was in fact making the situation worse, the power of suggestion on a child in pain. But the effect, whatever its cause, was real enough that Alexandra became convinced of Rasputin's supernatural healing powers and correspondingly devoted to his continued presence at court. This devotion became, in the years between 1905 and 1916, a significant political liability for the Romanov dynasty. Rasputin was not a careful man. He drank, he had affairs, or was alleged to have them, with a frequency that generated gossip in St. Petersburg society circles. His influence over Alexandra, and through her over the Tsar's decisions, was resented by the aristocracy and by the government officials who found themselves subject to the whims of a Siberian peasant holy man who had no formal position in the imperial structure. During the First World War, as Russia suffered catastrophic losses and the Tsar himself went to the front, leaving Alexandra as the de facto regent, Rasputin's influence over government appointments and policies became a source of genuine political fury. By late 1916, a conspiracy had formed to remove him. The conspirators included Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar. They lured Rasputin to the Yusupov Palace on the night of December 29, 1916. What followed, as described in the accounts that were later given by the participants, primarily Felix Yusupov himself, has become one of the most famous assassination narratives in modern history, partly because it is extraordinary and partly because there is significant reason to doubt that it happened quite the way Yusupov described it. In the official Yusupov version of events, Rasputin was given cakes and wine that had been laced with cyanide. He ate and drank. He did not die. He continued drinking wine. He continued not dying. He played the guitar and asked to meet Yusupov's wife. Yusupov, alarmed by Rasputin's failure to respond to what should have been a lethal dose of cyanide, shot him at close range with a revolver. Rasputin fell. Yusupov checked him and believed him dead. He left the room. He returned some time later. Rasputin opened his eyes, grabbed Yusupov by the throat, attempted to strangle him, tore an epaulette from his uniform, and ran, or staggered, or crawled, into the palace courtyard. He was shot several more times by a co-conspirator, Purishkevich, who followed him into the courtyard. He was shot again by Yusupov, who returned to beat him with a rubber club. He was then rolled in a sheet, tied with ropes, and thrown into the Neva River through a hole in the ice. When his body was recovered some days later, the autopsy found water in his lungs, suggesting, in the most lurid interpretation, that he had been alive when he went into the river. Historians have been treating this account with increasing skepticism for some time. The cyanide story in particular has been questioned. The amount described should have been immediately fatal, and alternative explanations for why it did not kill him have been proposed, including the possibility that the sugar in the cakes neutralized the poison, or that the cyanide was not actually administered in the quantities claimed, or that Yusupov embellished the account after the fact to dramatize the difficulty of killing a man he wanted history to regard as supernaturally dangerous. There is also evidence suggesting that a British intelligence officer, Oswald Rayner, who was present at the palace that night, may have fired the shot that actually killed Rasputin, which would add a dimension of British involvement to the story that the official Russian account omits entirely. What is not in doubt? Rasputin was killed in December 1916. His body was found in the river. The dynasty he had been entangled with outlasted him by approximately 1 year. Nicholas II abdicated in March of 1917, and the entire Romanov family was executed in July of 1918. Whether the removal of Rasputin saved the dynasty or whether the dynasty was already past saving by December 1916 is a question that belongs to the much larger question of whether the Russian Revolution was inevitable, a question that historians have not, after a century of trying, resolved. Rasputin himself has not faded. He appears in films, in musicals, in novels, in internet discussions, in the popular consciousness as the mysterious Siberian peasant who could not be killed, who bewitched an empress, who drank wine with the aristocracy and borrowed their wives, and survived poison and bullets until the night he didn't. The image is larger than the man. It probably was, even in his own lifetime. He seemed to understand this, to understand that the myth of himself was one of his primary instruments, and to cultivate it with the instincts of a performer. He wrote, in a letter left behind before his death, a prophecy, that if he were killed by ordinary people, the Tsar and his family would live for years. But if he were killed by nobles, the Tsar would not survive 2 years, and the nobility of Russia would be destroyed by peasants. He was killed by nobles. The Romanov dynasty was gone within the year. The Russian nobility was, within a generation, destroyed. Whether this constitutes prophecy or pattern recognition or coincidence is the kind of question that Rasputin himself would have enjoyed enormously. There is a coldness that settles over certain centuries that is different from the coldness of individual winters. It is deeper and more systemic. A change not in the weather of a single year or decade, but in the baseline conditions of an entire climatic era, the kind of shift that rewrites what is possible for the people living within it and what is not. The Little Ice Age was one of those shifts, and its effects on European civilization between approximately 1300 and 1850 were so pervasive, so interwoven with every other aspect of the period, that historians have spent decades arguing about where the Little Ice Age ends and ordinary history begins. The term itself is something of a misnomer in the way that many popular scientific labels are. It suggests a uniform, uninterrupted cold that in fact manifested as a series of severe cold periods separated by warmer intervals, with the most intense phases falling roughly in the early 17th century and in the decades around 1800. It was not a glaciation in any geological sense. The ice sheets did not advance south from Scandinavia to cover Europe. What happened was more subtle and, in some ways, more devastating precisely because of its subtlety. Average temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere dropped by perhaps 1 to 2 degrees Celsius relative to the preceding medieval warm period. To modern ears, accustomed to discussions of global warming in which a 2-degree increase is treated as a potential civilizational threshold, that number may sound modest. In practice, as a sustained shift in agricultural conditions across an entire continent, it was anything but. The Little Ice Age's relationship with human history is not simply that it made things colder. It is that it made them unpredictable in a specific, agriculturally catastrophic way. The growing season shortened. Harvests that had been reliable became unreliable. Crops that had been cultivated at certain latitudes and altitudes for centuries could no longer be grown there. The vineyards of England, which had flourished during the medieval warm period and produced acceptable wine, died. The grain harvests of France, already subject to the uncertainties of pre-modern agriculture, became erratic in ways that produced periodic famines with an intensity that the warmer preceding centuries had not prepared populations for. The effects on the lives of ordinary people unfolded across generations and across the entire social structure. In the coldest decades of the 17th century, rivers and harbors that had not frozen in living memory froze regularly. The Thames in London froze solidly enough in the winters of 1607, 1621, 1635, 1649, 1684, and several other years for entire frost fairs to be held on its surface. Markets, games, fire pits, printing presses, roasting oxen, all of it taking place on the ice of a river that is not supposed to freeze. The last Thames Frost Fair was in 1814, and the river has not frozen since, partly because the warming that followed the Little Ice Age's final phase, and partly because the removal of the old London Bridge in 1831, whose many arches had trapped ice flows and accelerated freezing, changed the river's thermal dynamics. In the mountain regions of Europe, the glaciers advanced. Alpine villages that had coexisted with their local glaciers for centuries found those glaciers moving toward them with a pace that was slow by any absolute measure, but terrifying in its directionality. The ice creeping down valleys, covering farmland, approaching villages that had been there for generations. In several documented cases, communities petitioned the church to conduct exorcism ceremonies on the advancing glaciers, seeking to stop by spiritual means what they could not stop by physical ones. The ceremonies were held. The glaciers continued their advance, indifferent to excommunication. The cold drove social change in ways that are difficult to fully trace but impossible to ignore. The great European witch trials, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, the same period as some of the Little Ice Age's most severe phases, have been analyzed by historians who note the correlation between failed harvests, community stress, and the search for human agents of supernatural malevolence. Whether the climate directly caused the witch trials is too simple a causal claim, but the relationship between widespread, inexplicable suffering and the need to find someone to blame is well established in the historical and psychological literature, and the Little Ice Age created exactly the conditions: repeated crop failures, livestock deaths, unusual weather, community anxiety, in which accusation and persecution historically thrive. There is also the question of the Little Ice Age's relationship with the great population movements of the early modern period. The emigration from Europe to the Americas was driven by many forces: religious, economic, political, but among them was the simple fact that Europe, in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a harder place to sustain a life than it had been 2 centuries earlier, and the Americas, whatever their actual difficulties, represented the possibility of land and harvest unconstrained by the deteriorating conditions of the home continent. The Little Ice Age helped push people off one landmass and onto another. It also shaped the arts. The violin as we know it today, the Stradivarius and Guarneri instruments that are still considered the pinnacle of string instrument making, were crafted during the Little Ice Age, and there is a theory, developed by dendrochronologist Henri Gracino-Mayer and climatologist Lloyd Burkle, that the exceptional acoustic properties of these instruments may be related to the wood from which they were made. The slow-growing trees of Little Ice Age forests, subject to reduced growing seasons and more compact annual rings, produced timber with a density and consistency that later, faster-grown wood could not replicate. The cold that killed harvests and drove glaciers across alpine villages may also have grown the trees that gave the world its finest violins. History operates this way sometimes, drawing contradictory things from the same source, making beauty and catastrophe from the same raw material. The Little Ice Age lasted approximately 500 years. The transition out of it was gradual and is still not entirely complete in some regions. The climate we live in now, warmer, more unstable in different ways, is partly a recovery from the Little Ice Age and partly something else entirely, a new condition that does not have a satisfying precedent in the historical record. The frost fairs on the Thames are gone. The glaciers that advanced on alpine villages retreated, and then retreated further than they had ever been in recorded history, uncovering ground that had been under ice for centuries. The violin makers of Cremona are gone. But the instruments they made during those cold centuries are still being played in concert halls across the world. Their particular sound, that impossible warmth, that richness, carrying within it, perhaps, a trace of the winters that grew the wood that made them possible. On a clear February evening in Havana Harbor in 1898, the USS Maine sat at anchor in the warm Cuban waters, its crew of approximately 350 men going about the routines of a ship that was there not for combat, but for a specific kind of diplomatic presence. the kind that is officially called a courtesy call and unofficially understood by everyone involved as a statement of interest. A reminder of proximity, a polite and very large argument made in steel and iron about who, in the Caribbean, had leverage. Cuba in 1898 was still a Spanish colony, though it had been a Spanish colony in the way that a heavily bandaged wound is still a wound, barely contained, seeping at the edges, the product of a revolution that had begun in 1895 and was producing casualties and atrocities that the American press, led by newspapers including William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, was covering with an enthusiasm that went somewhat beyond conventional journalistic detachment. The phrase, yellow journalism, was coined largely for the coverage of Cuba in this period, sensationalized, emotionally manipulative, sometimes entirely fabricated, designed less to inform than to inflame. The American public, reading daily accounts of Spanish atrocities and Cuban suffering, was being prepared for something, though what exactly was still being worked out in the editorial offices of New York and the offices of the McKinley administration in Washington. The USS Maine had arrived in Havana on January 25, 1898. Its commander, Captain Charles Sigsbee, had navigated the courtesy call with considerable care, maintaining the delicate balance between American presence and American provocation that the situation required. The Spanish authorities in Havana were not pleased by the ship's arrival, but were in no position to object to it directly. The ship sat in the harbor. The crew went about their business. The days passed with the particular tension of a situation that everyone knows cannot remain static indefinitely. At 9:40 in the evening of February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded. The explosion, or more precisely, the two explosions, which witnesses described as a smaller detonation followed almost immediately by a vastly larger one, destroyed the forward section of the ship and killed 266 of the crew. Some died in the immediate blast. Others drowned as the ship sank. Some were trapped in the lower decks as the hull settled into the harbor mud and could not be reached before the water closed over them. The harbor was full of debris and fire and the sounds that accompany sudden mass casualty events on water. The question of what caused the explosion became immediately, intensely political because the answer to that question had immediate, intense political implications. If the Maine had been blown up by Spain, deliberately or through negligence, the American case for intervention in Cuba acquired a justification that transcended the arguments about press freedom and Cuban suffering that had been building for 3 years. If the explosion was an accident internal to the ship, a spontaneous combustion in the coal bunkers that were stored adjacent to the ammunition magazines, which was a known hazard of the warships of the era, then there was no enemy, no atrocity, no justification for war. The American press did not wait for the inquiry. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," was printed on buttons and broadsides and shouted at rallies within days of the explosion. Hearst's journal ran front-page accusations of Spanish sabotage backed by minimal evidence and considerable imagination. The public outrage that followed was genuine, though it had been substantially manufactured by the same newspapers that were now reporting on it as though it had arisen spontaneously. The official American naval inquiry, concluded in late March of 1898, found that the Maine had been destroyed by an external explosion, a mine, though it declined to assign responsibility for the mine to any specific party. This finding provided the political momentum needed. The Spanish-American War began in April of 1898, lasted approximately 4 months, and ended with Spain ceding Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. American power in the Pacific and the Caribbean was permanently and dramatically expanded. The explosion of the USS Maine had, in the space of those 4 months, reshaped the geopolitical map of 2 oceans. But the question of what actually caused the explosion was not settled by the 1898 inquiry, and it has not been settled since. A second American inquiry in 1911, conducted when the wreck was partially raised, also concluded that an external explosion was responsible. But subsequent investigations, including a major study commissioned in 1974 by Admiral Hyman Rickover, which examined all the available evidence using modern forensic methods, concluded that the most likely cause was an internal explosion, probably the spontaneous combustion of coal dust adjacent to an ammunition magazine. A 1998 National Geographic analysis, using computer modeling of the explosion, supported the internal explosion theory, but noted that the evidence was not fully conclusive. The Maine has been resting at the bottom of Havana Harbor, or rather, the portion of it that was not raised in 1911 has been resting there since February of 1898. The harbor mud has covered it. The waters have closed over it. Whatever the truth of what happened on the evening of the 15th, it sits down there with the remains of the men who could not be recovered, in the warm water of a harbor that was the trigger point for a war that changed the shape of American power for generations. Remember the Maine became one of the most successful rallying cries in American political history, a phrase that converted a disaster of uncertain origin into a moral clarity that it may or may not have deserved. The history of how nations decide to go to war is, in part, a history of how they manage uncertainty, how they convert the ambiguous and the unknown into the clear and the actionable. The USS Maine, in Havana Harbor in 1898, was an ambiguous event that was converted into a clear one by the force of political will and the energy of a press that had decided what it wanted the story to mean before the smoke had cleared. Whether that conversion was justified, whether the war it produced was just, whether the expansion of American power that followed was beneficial or harmful to the people most affected by it. These are questions that historians and the descendants of the people involved are still arguing. The explosion itself, the fact of it, the 266 men it killed, those remain. They remain in the harbor. They remain in the historical record. And they remain in the specific quality of ambiguity that surrounds them, the not quite resolved quality that attaches itself to moments when the truth of what happened and the story that was told about it diverge in the dark, and the story wins. What started in the early 17th century in the Dutch Republic was not a war. It was not a plague. It was not the kind of catastrophe that announces itself with cannon fire or the grinding of tectonic plates. What it was, what it still is, in the annals of human economic behavior, is perhaps the most elegant proof ever recorded that a society, given the right conditions, can lose its collective mind over something as small and as fragile as a flower. Tulip mania, they call it now, with the faint condescension of people looking backward. But stand for a moment in Amsterdam in 1636 and try to feel the air the way the people who lived it felt it. The city is prosperous in a way that seems almost miraculous. The Dutch Golden Age is in full, extraordinary flower. The irony of that word will become apparent. Trade routes snake across the globe, and the wealth flowing back through Amsterdam's canals has created a merchant class with money to spend, ambition to invest, and an appetite for beauty that no other civilization at that moment could quite match. The Dutch loved their gardens. They loved them with a seriousness that bordered on the philosophical. A well-tended garden was not merely decoration. It was a statement about one's relationship to nature, to God, to civilization itself. And into this environment, sometime in the mid-16th century, came the tulip. It had traveled a long road to reach Amsterdam. Originally cultivated in the Ottoman Empire, the tulip arrived in Europe via Flanders in the 1550s, and almost immediately it caused a quiet sensation. It was unlike any flower most Europeans had ever seen. Where roses curved and softened at the petal, the tulip stood upright, geometric, almost architectural in its precision. It had a boldness to it, a visual confidence. And the varieties that began appearing in the Dutch Republic in the early decades of the 17th century were unlike anything anyone had cultivated before. There was a particular phenomenon, not understood at the time, later identified as a mosaic virus spread by the peach potato aphid, that caused some tulip bulbs to produce flowers of extraordinary, feathered, flame-like patterns. Where a plain tulip might be a solid red or a solid yellow, a so-called broken tulip would erupt in intricate streaks and swirls of color, white bleeding into crimson, violet threading through ivory. These flowers looked less like something grown from soil and more like something painted by a hand of impossible delicacy. They looked, to the 17th century eye, like a miracle. These broken tulips were extraordinarily difficult to reproduce predictably. A grower might nurture a bulb for years and never know whether it would produce the coveted pattern. This unpredictability, combined with the stunning visual results, made certain varieties almost impossibly rare. And rarity, as any economist will tell you, is the engine of desire. By the 1620s, wealthy collectors were paying substantial sums for single bulbs of the most prized varieties. This was, at first, simply the behavior of connoisseurs, the same impulse that led patrons to commission Rembrandt or Vermeer. A beautiful, rare tulip bulb was not so different, in this social context, from a beautiful, rare painting. It was an investment in beauty, in status, in the cultivated life. And so it remained for a while. What happened next is the part that history has never entirely agreed on in its details, but the broad shape of it is this. At some point in the mid-1630s, the tulip market crossed a threshold from the behavior of connoisseurs into something that resembled, with breathtaking clarity, speculation. Merchants who had never gardened a day in their lives began buying bulbs not because they wanted to grow them, not because they intended to put them in their estates and admire them through the winter glass, but because they expected to sell them to someone else for more than they had paid. And because enough people shared this expectation, the expectation became, for a time, self-fulfilling. Prices that had been high became extraordinary. The Semper Augustus, the most coveted of all the broken tulips, a white flower with crimson flames and a breathtaking symmetry, reached prices that are almost impossible to fully contextualize. At the peak of the mania, a single Semper Augustus bulb was reportedly valued at the equivalent of a large house on Amsterdam's finest canal. Not a room in a house with a garden, on the water. And this was not a single eccentric transaction. Across the Republic, across the networks of tradespeople and artisans and merchants who had, in the booming Dutch economy, accumulated small amounts of disposable capital, tulip bulbs were being bought and sold with a feverish intensity. What made the mechanics of the mania particularly strange was the fact that, for much of the trading period, the bulbs were still in the ground. Tulips bloom in spring. Trade was happening in the winter months. What was being exchanged was not the flower, not even the bulb that could be held in the hand, but a promissory note, a contract, essentially, a claim on a bulb that would be deliverable in the spring. Futures contracts. The Dutch had, in their financial ingenuity, invented a kind of derivative market, and they had done so around a flower. The atmosphere in the taverns where much of this trading happened must have been extraordinary. Picture the low ceilings and the yellow lamplight, the smell of tobacco and the sour edge of ale, men passing slips of paper back and forth, scrawling names of varieties that had become like incantations. Viceroy, Admiral Van and Cuisin, Gouda, Bizarden. The names alone carried weight, carried the promise of transformation. You could walk into one of those taverns with the wages of a skilled craftsman and emerge, in theory, with a contract that promised wealth. That was the story people told themselves. That was the story the prices seemed to confirm. But prices in a speculative market do not confirm stories forever. They eventually confirm reality. And the reality, when it arrived in February 1637, arrived without announcement. The precise moment of collapse is, like most economic catastrophes, somewhat difficult to locate with a surgeon's precision. What appears to have happened is that at a routine bulb auction in Haarlem, buyers simply did not appear. A batch of tulips that should have sold, according to the prevailing logic of the market, for a substantial sum, found no buyers willing to pay the expected price. This moment, quiet, almost domestic in its setting, was the first tremor. Word traveled. Other buyers held back. Sellers, sensing danger, began to lower prices. And the psychology of the market, which had for years operated on the shared belief that prices would always rise, snapped. Not gradually, almost instantly. Within weeks, the prices that had seemed immovable had collapsed. A bulb that had been worth a house was worth, suddenly, the price of a common onion. A comparison that contemporaries made themselves, with a mixture of dark humor and genuine anguish. Men who had pledged their life savings, who had mortgaged their shops and workshops on the promise of tulip fortunes, found themselves looking at a slip of paper that was now worth nothing. Families were ruined. There were court cases, arguments, desperate attempts by the Dutch government to figure out how to void the contracts or enforce them. The legal situation was chaotic because many of the contracts had been made informally, in taverns, without the oversight of the formal commodities exchange. And yet, and here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, where the footnotes begin to diverge from the legend. The Dutch Golden Age did not end. The economy of the Republic, robust and diversified and resting on trade and empire rather than on flower speculation, absorbed the shock and continued. The tulip mania was, in economic terms, not a civilization-ending catastrophe. It ruined individuals, certainly. It left lasting psychological scars. But the windmills kept turning. The ships kept sailing. What the tulip mania left behind, more than debt or ruin, was a story. A story about human desire and the strange, unpredictable ways in which collective belief can inflate and then puncture a market. In the centuries since, economists and historians have debated the scale and the mechanics of the crash, some arguing that its scope has been exaggerated by later moralists looking for a cautionary tale. But the core of the story remains stubbornly, fascinatingly true. People really did pay extraordinary sums for flowers. The market really did collapse with startling speed. And the tulip, that geometric, flame-streaked visitor from the Ottoman East, became something more than a flower. It became an idea about greed and beauty and the peculiar madness of markets. There is something quietly melancholy about the Semper Augustus. No specimen exists today. The virus that produced its extraordinary patterns, the virus that made it the most coveted object in one of the wealthiest societies on Earth, eventually killed its hosts. The flame-streaked tulips burned themselves out, and the world they decorated burned with them, in its own way. What remains is only the description: white petals threaded with red, a flower that was worth a house, a flower that drove a civilization briefly, brilliantly mad. And from that particular madness, we move now into a different kind of darkness, one less about desire than about fear, less about what people wanted than about what they were convinced walked among them. Because across Eastern Europe, in the decades and centuries following the Black Death, and extending well into the 18th century, something was spreading that was not a plague in the conventional sense. It had no bacteria. It could not be measured in a laboratory or identified under a lens. But it moved through communities with the same terrible momentum as any epidemic. It changed behavior. It caused violence. It exhumed the dead. And it was, in its own strange way, as revealing a window into the human mind as any economic bubble or military catastrophe. The vampire panic in Europe, the real vampire panic, not the romantic fiction that later writers would confect from its bones, was one of the most sustained and geographically widespread episodes of mass hysteria in recorded history. And it is impossible to understand it without first understanding the world in which it took root. Rural Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries was a world of extraordinary darkness, not metaphorically, but literally. The nights were long and uninterrupted by artificial light. The forests were genuinely dangerous, and medicine was still, by modern standards, barely distinguishable from superstition. Diseases that we can now identify and treat with precision were then invisible enemies, understood only through their effects. The wasting away of a body, the pallor of a patient's skin, the blood that came up in a cough. When a healthy person died unexpectedly, and then members of their family began to sicken and die in succession, the explanation that suggested itself to a community without germ theory was not bacteria or viral transmission. It was something else, something that had not quite left. The revenant, the dead who returned, was not a new idea. Virtually every culture in human history has believed, at some point, in some form of the restless dead. But in certain villages of Serbia, Moravia, Hungary, and the surrounding regions, this belief took on a particular, local specificity in the late 17th century. The dead, it was believed, could return to their villages in a physical form that was not quite ghostly, but not quite living. They could walk. They could knock on doors. They could enter homes through windows or cracks in the wall, and they could drain the vitality, sometimes the blood, of the living. The word vampire or vampire appears in records from this region in the early 18th century, and when it does, it is not in the context of folklore being recited at a fireside. It is in official documents, government documents, military documents. Because the Habsburg Empire, which administered much of this territory, took the reports seriously enough to send investigators. The case of Arnold Paule is perhaps the most famous, and it illustrates the mechanics of a vampire panic with disturbing clarity. Paule was a Serbian soldier who died in the village of Medveđa in 1726, falling from a hay wagon and breaking his neck. Before his death, Paule had apparently told his neighbors that he had been troubled by a vampire during his service in Greece or Turkey, and that he had dealt with it by eating the earth from its grave and smearing himself with its blood, a local remedy. When Paule died and 4 of his neighbors subsequently died of an unspecified illness, the community reached the conclusion that Paule himself had become a vampire and was responsible. The graves were opened. What the exhumers reported finding was not a decomposed corpse, but something they described as preternaturally preserved. Flesh still pliable, blood still liquid in the veins, new growth apparent on the nails and skin. They reported that when the body was staked, it groaned and bled. The head was severed, the body was burned, and for a period, the death stopped. This case was documented, reported, and eventually investigated by 2 Austrian military surgeons, Johannes Fluckinger and Johann Sigismund Pump, who in 1732 produced an official report titled Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered, that described a subsequent outbreak in the same village in startling, clinical, medical detail. Their report traveled across Europe. It was printed. It was read by the educated public. It was debated by philosophers and doctors and theologians. And it brought the word vampire and the concept behind it into the consciousness of Western Europe for the first time. What followed was not quite what Fluckinger and his colleagues had intended. Instead of dismissing the Serbian peasantry's beliefs as primitive superstition, the report, with its veneer of clinical observation, its measurements, and its Latin title, gave the vampire a kind of scientific credibility, or at least scientific ambiguity. If trained surgeons were documenting these things, could the stories be entirely without foundation? The panic spread westward with a momentum that, in retrospect, maps fairly neatly onto the routes of communication and trade. Villages in Moravia and Hungary began reporting their own vampire outbreaks. Church authorities became involved, which meant that the theological dimensions of the question, what is the soul? Can the dead truly walk? What is the relationship between the body and the spirit after death? Were debated with genuine seriousness at the highest levels of religious and academic discourse. Voltaire wrote about vampires, with his characteristic acidity, suggesting that the financiers who bled the public were the real vampires worth worrying about. The Empress Maria Theresa, pragmatic and skeptical, eventually dispatched her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate the reports in Moravia. Van Swieten was unimpressed. His report, delivered in 1755, was brisk and dismissive. The apparent preservation of corpses was a natural phenomenon, he argued, explained by soil conditions, temperature, and the well-documented variability of decomposition. The blood that appeared fresh was a product of the breakdown process. The sounds, the groaning, the sighing, that witnesses reported when bodies were exhumed or staked were the release of gases from a decomposing torso. There was no vampire. There was only a dead body doing what dead bodies do, imperfectly understood by people who had never studied anatomy. Maria Theresa accepted this conclusion and issued imperial decrees forbidding the exhumation and mutilation of corpses on vampire suspicion. The official panic in the Habsburg lands subsided, but the beliefs that had generated it did not disappear. They retreated into the villages, into the oral tradition, into the stories told around fires on winter nights, where they waited. What Van Swieten's analysis missed, what the official record almost always misses, is the human dimension behind the exhumations. These were not simply credulous people performing irrational rituals. They were communities in the grip of genuine, serial, inexplicable death. When a family loses one member, and then another, in a world without germ theory, the need for an explanation, for agency, for something that can be stopped, is not a failure of reason. It is reason operating on the information available. The vampire, horrible as it was, had the merit of being stoppable. Dig it up. Stake it. Burn it. Take action. Do something. That is a deeply human need, and it does not become less understandable simply because the cause it identified was wrong. There is also the matter of what the investigators were actually seeing when they opened those graves. Modern forensic science has spent considerable effort studying the phenomenon of corpse preservation, and what it has found is genuinely unsettling to those accustomed to the tidy decomposition of crime fiction. Decomposition is extraordinarily variable. Certain soil conditions, certain temperatures, certain burial depths can delay it dramatically. The appearance of blood at the mouth is common in bodies that died of certain respiratory diseases, tuberculosis in particular, the disease that almost certainly caused many of the cluster deaths that triggered vampire accusations. The apparent growth of nails and hair after death is an optical illusion caused by the retraction of the skin as the body dries. The groaning of a staked corpse is exactly what Van Swieten said it was. But to a person standing at an open grave in a forest in Serbia in 1726, holding a torch, having watched 3 of his neighbors die in the past month, these explanations would not have come easily. And so the vampire panic endures as something more than a curiosity. It is a record of what happens when a community encounters death at a scale and in a pattern it cannot explain. It is a record of official responses, military, medical, imperial, colliding with folk belief and producing something stranger than either could have generated alone. And it left, in its wake, a figure that would haunt the European imagination for centuries: the undead, the revenant, the thing that should be in the ground but is not. There is something appropriate about the fact that the most famous vampire in fiction, the one that crystallized all these fears and anxieties into a single, enduring form, was not created until 1897, nearly 200 years after Fluckinger filed his report. Bram Stoker's Dracula drew on this whole tradition, and in doing so, transformed it. The village panic became Gothic literature. The fear became entertainment. But the transformation was never entirely complete. The thing in the story still walks. It still drains the living. It still cannot quite die. Now, before we move deeper into the medieval world, we must stop for a moment at one of the most peculiarly comic episodes in the history of armed conflict. An episode that, were it not documented in contemporary chronicles, would read like the plot of a farce written by someone who despised the dignity of warfare. The War of the Bucket. It sounds like something from a children's story, and in a sense, that is precisely what makes it so extraordinary. Because men really did go to war over a bucket. Not metaphorically. Not in the sense that a bucket was a symbol for something larger. A bucket. Wooden. Presumably quite ordinary. And the war it triggered, the Battle of Zappolino, fought in 1325, was a genuinely significant military engagement. One of the largest battles in the history of northern Italy, involving tens of thousands of soldiers, resulting in thousands of casualties, and reshaping the political geography of the Po Valley. To understand how a bucket could cause a war, you need to understand northern Italy in the early 14th century, a landscape so comprehensively devoted to political violence that it makes our own era seem almost placid. The cities of the region, Bologna, Modena, Ferrara, Milan, Florence, Padua, Verona, were locked in a complex, constantly shifting web of alliances, rivalries, and ancient enmities that had their roots in the great divide of medieval politics. The conflict between the Guelphs, who supported the authority of the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. These were not merely abstract political positions. They were tribal identities that organized every aspect of public life, determined who married whom, who could be trusted in a business deal, who might stab you in an alley on a Tuesday evening. Bologna was Guelph. Modena was Ghibelline. They shared a border, and they hated each other with the concentrated, personal intensity that only neighbors can achieve. In 1325, a group of Modenese soldiers, the exact circumstances are slightly murky in the sources, as the circumstances of incidents that lead to embarrassing wars tend to be, raided a Bolognese well near the city gate. What they took, in addition to whatever else they may have been after, was an oak bucket, a well bucket. The kind used every day to draw water, the kind so mundane and so utilitarian that it barely registers in the visual world. The Modenese took it back to Modena. They may have thought it was funny. They may not have thought about it at all. Bologna was not amused. The city demanded the return of the bucket. Modena refused. Whether this was genuine political stubbornness, the desire to preserve a face-saving trophy, or simply the pleasure of annoying a neighbor, no one is entirely certain. What is certain is that the refusal was treated by Bologna not as a petty insult to be absorbed and forgotten, but as an act of sufficient provocation to justify a military response. The armies that gathered were substantial. Bologna, drawing on its Guelph allies, assembled a force estimated at somewhere between 30 and 35,000 men. Modena, with its Ghibelline connections and its own military tradition, gathered perhaps 15,000. On the 4th of November, 1325, these forces met at Zapolino, in the hills south of Medina, and engaged in a battle that lasted approximately half a day. At the end of it, the Bolognese army was in retreat, having suffered significant casualties, and Medina's forces returned home victorious. The bucket was not returned. According to tradition, and tradition in this case is almost certainly right, because it is too good a detail to be invented, the bucket was taken to the Cathedral of Medina, the Duomo, where it was placed on display. In a basket, hanging from the ceiling. In the cathedral, it is still there. Or rather, the bucket that is identified as that bucket is still there, displayed in the Palazzo Comunale in Medina, though historians debate whether it is genuinely the original. The cathedral holds a replica. The poetry of this outcome is not entirely lost on the people of Medina, who have maintained the tradition with a certain cheerful civic pride. But the poetry does not quite cover the reality, which is that thousands of men died, fighting over a bucket that had been stolen on what was probably a drunken dare, or a moment of casual contempt, or simple mischief. The kind of incident that, in a different political climate, might have been laughed off at a border meeting between two city governors. Instead, it fed into the existing machinery of Guelph Ghibelline hatred, which was always ready to convert the smallest slight into a military justification. There is a lesson somewhere in the bucket, and it is not a particularly comfortable one. Wars very often begin not with the grand causes that historians later construct to explain them, but with something small and stupid and irreversible, a miscalculation, a moment of pride, a bucket. The cause is a pretext. The war is what was always coming. The bucket just happened to be holding the door open. And yet the war of the bucket sits in its own peculiar category, because unlike so many conflicts that begin with trivial incidents, it never escalated beyond its initial absurdity. It did not trigger a regional war. It did not reshape the map of Europe. It was fought, it was won by one side, and the bucket stayed where it was, which is, perhaps, the most Italian ending imaginable. A beautiful object displayed in a beautiful building, commemorating a beautiful piece of human stubbornness that cost thousands of lives and accomplished nothing at all. From that stubborn wooden object and the absurdly human conflict it generated, we turn now to something that carries no comedy at all, something that sits at the intersection of military history and the history of disease in a way that still, even centuries later, produces a chill. Because in 1346, on the shores of the Black Sea, in a Genoese trading colony called Caffa, something happened that would reshape the world. Not the world as it was, the world as it would be. The siege of Caffa and the beginning of what we now call the Black Death in Europe are connected by a weapon so terrible, so simple in its conception, and so catastrophic in its execution, that military historians still cite it as one of the earliest documented examples of biological warfare. And the word warfare, in this context, is not metaphorical. Someone made a decision. Someone gave an order. And the consequences of that order would kill, in the most conservative estimates, a third of Europe's population. Caffa, modern Feodosia, in Crimea, was a prosperous Genoese trading post on the northern coast of the Black Sea, a hub of the extraordinary commercial network that connected Europe to the Silk Road, to the markets of Central Asia, to the spices and silks and technologies of the East. The Mongol rulers of the region, the Golden Horde, had generally tolerated the Genoese presence because trade was profitable and Genoa was useful. But by the mid-14th century, the relationship had deteriorated. Conflicts between Genoese merchants and local Tatar traders had escalated into violence. And in 1346, the Khan of the Golden Horde, Yani Beg, brought an army to the walls of Caffa and began a siege. The siege was not going well for Yani Beg. The Genoese were stubborn defenders, well supplied by sea, and the Mongol army was equipped for the steppe, not for prolonged siege warfare on a fortified coastal town. And then, within the besieging camp, something far more terrible than the Genoese garrison arrived. The plague had been moving west for years. Its origins were somewhere in Central Asia. Modern scholarship has identified the Tian Shan region as a likely source, where there is evidence of mass mortality in the 1330s and 1340s. Along the Silk Road, along the trade routes that connected the steppes of Asia to the ports of the Black Sea, it traveled. The rat flea, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that, in its pneumonic and septicemic forms, could kill a person in hours, and in its bubonic form could kill in days, with the swelling of the lymph nodes into hard, painful masses that the medieval world called buboes. The plague arrived in Yani Beg's army and began to kill his men with a speed that must have seemed, to those watching, like the wrath of something incomprehensible. The siege began to collapse not because of Genoese resistance, but because the besieging army was dying. And then someone, a commander, a general, a man whose name history has not preserved, decided to use the dead. The chronicler Gabriele de Musis, a lawyer from Piacenza who wrote an account of the plague's arrival in Europe, described what happened in terms that are spare and matter-of-fact and somehow, because of that plainness, more horrifying than if they had been sensationalized. The Mongols, he wrote, catapulted the bodies of men who had died of the disease over the walls of Kaffa into the city. The corpses piled up in the streets. The Genoese defenders threw them into the sea as fast as they could, but the smell of death was everywhere. The air itself seemed corrupted, and before long, people inside the walls began to sicken. Whether this account is precisely accurate in every detail, historians debate the exact mechanism by which plague spreads, noting that bubonic plague is primarily transmitted by flea bite rather than direct contact with a corpse. The core of it appears to be true. Bodies were catapulted into the city. People inside the city became sick. And when the Genoese, finally recognizing that something catastrophic was happening, abandoned Kaffa and fled by ship, they carried the plague with them. Their ships stopped at Constantinople, at Messina, at Genoa and Venice and Marseilles. At each port, people who came aboard or came near the ships sickened and died. The plague that had been festering in Central Asia for years moved, in the span of months, from the Black Sea coast to the heart of Europe. By 1347, it was in Constantinople. By 1348, it was in France and England. By 1350, it had reached Scandinavia. By the time it burned itself out, and it would return again and again, in subsequent waves, for centuries, it had killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people worldwide, perhaps half the population of some regions of Europe. De Musis wrote his account with a quality of almost stunned helplessness. He described people dying so fast that the survivors could not bury them. He described priests refusing to give last rites because they were afraid. He described the abandonment of cities, the flight of the wealthy to the countryside, the complete collapse of the social and religious structures that had organized medieval European life. And underlying all of it, the question that medieval theology was, ultimately, unable to answer. Why? What had humanity done to deserve this? The question of what role the siege of Kaffa played in the Black Death's arrival in Europe is still debated. The plague may have arrived through other routes as well. There were multiple potential pathways along the trade networks. But Kaffa is the documented point. It is the place where the siege became a weapon. And the man who gave the order to load the dead bodies into the catapults, whoever he was, whatever his name, made a decision that changed the world. He did not know what he was unleashing. He could not have. He thought he was using disease as a tactical tool in a siege he was losing. He could not have imagined that the thing he was throwing over the walls would travel by ship to a continent he had never seen and kill people who had never heard of Kaffa, who had no idea that a Mongol army was besieging a Genoese city on the Black Sea coast, who were simply living their lives, plowing fields, baking bread, praying in cathedrals, when death arrived at their doors. That is the weight of Kaffa. That is why it sits in the record not just as a military curiosity, but as something grimly foundational to the modern world. The Black Death did not only kill people. It killed a worldview. The medieval certainty, the conviction that the universe was ordered, that suffering had meaning, that God's hand was visible in earthly events, did not survive the plague fully intact. What came after was different, more anxious, more uncertain, more modern in some ways. The siege of Kaffa, and the weapon that a desperate general improvised on the shores of the Black Sea, helped break open a world. There is a strange kind of frozen beauty in what follows. Not the beauty of flowers or architecture or the human desire for luxury, but something much older and more elemental. The beauty of water stopped cold in its tracks. Because on the River Thames, at various points between the late 16th century and the early 19th, winter did something remarkable. It froze. Not at the edges. Not in a thin, uncertain skin of ice that would crack if you stepped on it. It froze solid. thick enough to bear the weight of horses, of cannons, of tents, of fires, thick enough to hold a city. The Thames Frost Fairs were not planned events. They were improvised responses to meteorological conditions that the modern world no longer experiences, because the modern world is warmer and because the old London Bridge, with its many narrow arches that slowed and disrupted the flow of the river, was demolished in 1831. But while they lasted, the first substantial fair in the winter of 1607 to 1608, the most famous in the extraordinary freeze of 1683 to 1684, and the last in 1814, they were something that defies easy categorization. They were part festival, part market, part carnival, part collective act of denial in the face of cold so severe it felt like the world was ending. Let the winter of 1683 settle around you for a moment. The freeze began in December and did not relent until the following February. 9 weeks of cold so sustained and so intense that the Thames turned to ice from bank to bank, from London Bridge almost to Gravesend. The ice was reported to be 11 inches thick in places. The city, already accustomed to cold winters in this era, the period climate scientists now call the Little Ice Age, a prolonged cooling of the northern hemisphere that lasted roughly from the mid-16th to the mid-19th century, recognized what was happening and responded in the way that Londoners have always responded to unusual conditions, with commerce and carnival. Within days of the ice becoming firm enough, the first booths appeared. Traders who had been selling from the riverbanks simply moved their stalls down to the ice itself. Then came the printers. The Frost Fairs are remarkable in part for the printers who set up their presses directly on the river and sold souvenir papers and pamphlets to fairgoers, sometimes including the name of the customer as a memento. Imagine that, standing on the frozen Thames in January 1684, purchasing a printed sheet that reads with your name and the date, proof that you were here, that you walked on the river, that the river held you. Then came the food sellers, the alehouses, the puppet shows, the dancing bears, the nine-pin alleys set up on the ice, the coaches driving up and down for the pleasure of driving on a frozen river, ox roasts, entire oxen roasted over open fires burning on the ice, the fat dripping down onto the frozen surface and the heat somehow not sufficient to melt it through. King Charles II himself walked on the Thames during the 1684 freeze, and so did his court, and so did Samuel Pepys, who recorded the scene with his characteristic combination of delight and slightly anxious accuracy. John Evelyn, Pepys's contemporary and fellow diarist, described it as a scene of unreal festivity, a city built overnight on what should be water, as if London had grown a second self in the dark cold. The sensory details that the diarists leave behind are extraordinary. The sound of coaches on ice was not smooth and gliding but rough and cracking, the iron-rimmed wheels biting into the surface. The smoke from the fires rose in the still, freezing air and hung there, creating a haze over the fair that must have given the whole scene a dreamlike quality. The Thames was not a pleasant smell at the best of times in the 17th century. It was the city's sewer as much as its highway. But in the freeze, the cold had locked that smell away, and the air was sharp and clean in a way that London air very rarely was. And the cold itself was not merely discomfort. It was danger. Reports from the time describe people falling through weakened ice at the edges of the fair, where the water ran faster and the ice was thinner. Coaches too heavy for a particular patch, cracking through. The fair existed, always, at the edge of catastrophe. The festivities proceeding on the assumption that the ice would hold, an assumption that was always only approximately true. There were at least 5 significant frost fairs in this period, each with its own character, its own duration, its own particular accidents and celebrations. The last one, in 1814, lasted only 4 days before the ice began to break up. But 4 days was enough for the fair to fully constitute itself, for the booths and the printing presses and the beer tents to appear as if by municipal planning, as if the city had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. One elephant was reportedly led across the Thames near Blackfriars Bridge during the 1814 fair, an act of showmanship so perfectly calibrated to the absurdity of the situation that it seems almost too good to be true. But the account exists. And then the ice broke, and the fair was over. And within a few decades, the combination of global warming, river management, and the demolition of Old London Bridge meant that the Thames would never freeze solid again. The frost fairs belong now to a climatic window that has closed. They are not merely historical events, but evidence of a world that no longer exists, a colder world, a world in which the river was more powerful and more unpredictable, a world in which winter was not an inconvenience, but a force capable of transforming the geography of a city overnight. There is something wistful about the frost fairs, something that sits at an angle to the usual emotions that history evokes. They were not grand or tragic. They were simply human, the impulse to celebrate, to sell, to gather, to make festivity out of adversity. The city built a party on top of its own frozen heart. And for a few weeks, the Thames was not a river at all. It was a street, a cold, uncertain, briefly magical street, and London walked on it with the pure pleasure of something impossible made real. That pleasure, that willingness to walk into the uncertain and the improbable, was not, unfortunately, always directed at frozen rivers and open-air markets. Sometimes it was directed at something far more catastrophic. Sometimes it was directed at the Holy Land, along roads that were long and cold and badly understood by people who had no business making the journey, but who had convinced themselves, or been convinced by others, that God required it of them. What is called the Children's Crusade of 1212 is one of those events in medieval history that resists clean interpretation. The sources are fragmentary and contradictory. The motivations of the people involved are obscure. The outcomes were largely disastrous. And yet the story has survived, has lodged itself in the historical consciousness in a way that more carefully documented events have not, because it seems to crystallize something important about the medieval mind, about faith and innocence, and the extraordinary capacity of human beings to follow a compelling voice off a cliff. The standard version of the story, as it has been told and retold since the 19th century, goes like this. In the summer of 1212, a young shepherd boy in France named Stephen of Cloyes claimed to have received a letter from Jesus Christ directing him to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. He gathered followers, thousands of them, mostly young, mostly poor, mostly children or adolescents, and marched them to the sea, where he promised the waters would part for them as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. When the sea failed to part, the mob dispersed. Simultaneously, a German boy named Nicholas of Cologne led a separate movement, also composed largely of the young and the poor, across the Alps toward Genoa and then to the sea. Of those who made it to the Mediterranean, some went home. Others were loaded onto ships by unscrupulous merchants who delivered them not to the Holy Land, but to North Africa, where they were sold into slavery. This is the story. And like many stories from the medieval period that have been told and retold, it is both substantially true and substantially misleading. Modern historians have largely disentangled the French and German movements, which appear to have been separate phenomena that later writers conflated into a single narrative. The participants were not exclusively children. The word puer in medieval Latin could mean youth or servant or poor person as well as child, and many of those involved were probably young adults in their teens or early 20s rather than the young children of popular imagination. The miraculous parting of the sea almost certainly did not happen as described, because no contemporary source describes it, and the kind of miracle that leaves no contemporary trace tends not to have occurred. But strip away the legendary accretion, and what remains is still remarkable. In the summer of 1212, significant numbers of poor, non-noble people in France and Germany were galvanized by charismatic young preachers into setting out on an unauthorized crusade. This was itself extraordinary in the context of crusading history, which had largely been the business of knights and kings. What the children's movement, and movement is perhaps the right word, rather than crusade, represented was a popular uprising of religious enthusiasm, a conviction among the disinherited and the marginalized that their purity and their faith qualified them to do what the rich and powerful and corrupt crusaders of the previous century had failed to do. Stephen of Cloyes, whatever his ultimate fate, gathered a crowd at Vendôme that contemporary sources put in the thousands. He preached. He reportedly performed miracles, or was said to. He carried what he claimed was a letter from Christ. The King of France, Philip II, was cautious and skeptical, and his scholars advised him that the venture was foolish. Stephen went ahead anyway, or tried to. The movement appears to have dissolved before it ever reached the sea, the crowd drifting away as the reality of the journey, the distance, The heat, the lack of food, the absence of any actual plan became apparent. The German movement under Nicholas of Cologne was, in some ways, more organized and more tragic. Nicholas led his followers across the Alps, a journey that was, in August, feasible but brutal, and reached Genoa in late summer 1212. By the time they arrived, the group that had set out was a fraction of its original size. The Alps had taken a toll. In Genoa, the sea did not part. The city took in some of the survivors. Genoese records show marriages between German crusaders and local women, suggesting that some settled permanently. Others went home. Some continued south, through Italy, toward the ports where they hoped to find passage. The accounts of what happened to those who found passage are murky and distressing. The story of the ships and the slave markets may be a conflation of multiple different fates, none of them clearly documented. But the general shape of the outcome, exhaustion, dispersal, death, and for at least some of the participants, capture and enslavement, appears to reflect something real. What the Children's Crusade really was, beneath the legendary surface, was a symptom. The established crusading movement was in crisis. Jerusalem had been lost again. The wealth and political power required for a successful crusade were concentrated in the hands of people who had, in the eyes of the poor and the devout, repeatedly failed. And into that frustration and that spiritual hunger stepped a series of young, charismatic, possibly genuinely visionary figures who told the poor what they desperately wanted to hear: that God had not abandoned them, that their poverty was not a sign of divine disfavor, but of divine preference, that the pure in heart would succeed where the armored and the wealthy had failed. That is a message with extraordinary power in any age. In 1212, in the context of medieval Christendom, with its belief in miracles and its terror of damnation, and its conviction that the physical possession of the Holy Sepulchre was a matter of profound spiritual urgency, it was powerful enough to put thousands of people on the road to a sea that would not part for them. The sea never does part, and the children who walked to meet it, whoever they really were, whatever age they really were, walked into something they could not have mapped in advance, guided by a faith that was entirely genuine and entirely insufficient for the road they were on. There is a kind of geographical ghost that haunts the history of cartography, not the ghosts of explorers who died in unmapped regions, not the legendary islands of medieval bestiary maps marked with dragons and sea monsters, but something stranger and more modern. Something that persisted on official, peer-reviewed, satellite-verified maps into the 21st century. Something that, when a scientific expedition finally sailed to the coordinates where it was supposed to exist, found nothing but open ocean. Sandy Island, or Isle de Sable as it appeared on French charts, was listed on the maps for decades. It appeared in the Times Atlas of the world. It appeared in Google Maps and Google Earth. It appeared with an apparent solidity and specificity, with coordinates, with dimensions, with the visual weight of a real place, in resources that billions of people use to understand the physical world. Located in the Coral Sea, off the northeastern coast of Australia, northwest of New Caledonia, it appeared to occupy an area of roughly 25 kilometers in length. In November 2012, a team of Australian scientists aboard the research vessel Southern Surveyor sailed to the coordinates of Sandy Island as part of a research expedition in the Coral Sea. They were not going to survey the island. They were passing near it, and one of the scientists thought it would be interesting to confirm its existence, or perhaps to collect some data. The ship arrived at the listed coordinates and found nothing. No island, no shallow water, no reefs, no sandbars, no suggestion of land. The water at those coordinates was, the ship's instruments confirmed, approximately 1,400 meters deep. Sandy Island did not exist. The subsequent investigation into the origin and persistence of this phantom island is a genuinely fascinating piece of archival and geographical detective work. The island appears to have originated in a chart drawn by a whaling vessel in the late 19th century, perhaps a misidentified reef, perhaps a navigational error, perhaps a pumice raft, which are real phenomena in which volcanic material creates a temporary floating mass that can be mistaken for land at a distance. Whatever its origin, the error entered the cartographic record and was then perpetuated by the process through which maps are made. Each map drawing on previous maps, each database inheriting the errors of its predecessors, each digital system importing the islands and coordinates of the analog maps that preceded it. The island's persistence into the digital age is perhaps the most instructive part of the story. We tend to think of digital mapping as a correction of analog error, more precise, more frequently updated, less susceptible to the kind of copying mistakes that plagued cartographic history. But Sandy Island reveals that digital systems inherit the errors of the analog systems on which they are based. The coordinates went into a database. The database fed Google Earth. Google Earth displayed the island. And the island, displayed on Google Earth, acquired a kind of secondary validation. Surely if it's on Google Earth, it must exist. There were, in fact, hints of wrongness visible if you looked carefully at the data. Certain databases that included ocean depth measurements showed deep water at those coordinates. Sailors who had navigated the region had noted the absence of the island. But the inconsistency never triggered the correction, because the process of cartographic correction requires someone to notice the inconsistency and care enough to investigate. That is what the scientists on the Southern Surveyor did, almost by accident, in 2012. Sandy Island is gone from the maps now, officially and permanently removed. But its absence is, in a way, more interesting than its presence. Because the story of Sandy Island is a story about the nature of authority in information systems. A fact, once entered into an authoritative source, acquires a kind of momentum that persists beyond its accuracy. The map says it is there. The atlas confirms the map. The digital database inherits the atlas. And the thing that is not there continues to be there, in the record, until someone has the patience and the curiosity to go look. There is something almost comforting about this, in a strange way. The world is still large enough for a 25-kilometer island to not exist without anyone noticing for decades. The record is still imperfect enough, still human enough, that errors can persist for a century and a half before being corrected. And the sea, that deep and indifferent sea, 1,400 meters deep at the coordinates of the Phantom Island, kept its secret without any particular effort. The desert, too, keeps its secrets, with far less apology and far less mercy. In 525 BCE, Cambyses II, king of Persia, son of Cyrus the Great, had conquered Egypt. This was not a small thing. Egypt was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, ancient even then by the standards of the era, with a culture and a power that had endured for thousands of years. Cambyses took it. He took Memphis. He took the pharaoh prisoner. He made himself the master of the Nile Valley and added Egypt to an empire that already stretched from Anatolia to India. But Cambyses, by many accounts, was not satisfied with conquest alone. He had scores to settle, or believed he did, with the oracle at Siwa, an oasis deep in the Libyan desert west of the Nile. The priests at Siwa had reportedly offered a prophecy unfavorable to Persian ambitions, or had sided with Cambyses' enemies. Whatever the specific grievance, Cambyses decided to punish the oracle. He assembled an army. Ancient sources give figures of 50,000 men, which modern historians regard as possibly exaggerated but potentially in the right order of magnitude, and sent it west into the desert. The army left the Nile Valley. It marched west, and then it disappeared. Not in the metaphorical sense that armies sometimes disappear from the historical record, swallowed by time and the gaps in documentation. It disappeared physically. It walked into the desert and did not come back. No survivors were reported. No remnants of the force were found. The oracle at Siwa was never attacked. The army, 50,000 strong, or however many it actually was, simply ceased to exist somewhere in the western desert of Egypt. Ancient sources, including Herodotus, describe what they believe happened. A sandstorm of catastrophic scale, the sky darkening, the wind rising to a pitch that buried everything beneath it, men and horses and equipment swallowed by the desert in a single event. It is a dramatic account, and its dramatic quality has made it one of the most persistent and tantalizing mysteries in ancient history. Archaeologists have been looking for the lost army of Cambyses for centuries. Literally centuries. European travelers and explorers in the 19th century searched for it. Egyptian archaeologists in the 20th century searched for it. In 2009, two brothers, Italian archaeologists named Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, announced that they had found evidence of the army in the desert near Siwa, scattered bones, corroded bronze weapons, what appeared to be human remains mixed with horse bones and military equipment, scattered across an area of the desert consistent with mass burial by a sandstorm. The announcement generated significant excitement. It generated significant skepticism. Other archaeologists questioned the interpretation of the evidence, noting that bones and artifacts in the desert are subject to extraordinary dispersal by wind over centuries, and that the evidence did not conclusively demonstrate the presence of a Persian army rather than some other assemblage of human and animal remains. The debate has not been definitively resolved. What has been definitively resolved, in the minds of those who have studied the question most carefully, is that the Western Desert is fully capable of swallowing an army without trace. The Sahara is not merely vast, it is hostile to preservation in ways that most depositional environments are not. Wind erosion is constant. The sand moves. What is buried one century may be exposed the next, and what is exposed may be scattered across dozens of kilometers by subsequent storms. Finding anything in the Western Desert that has been there for 2,500 years requires not just luck, but extraordinary persistence. And so the army remains, officially, lost. 50,000 men, or however many there were, who marched west into a desert on the orders of a king who believed himself descended from gods, and who found something in that desert that was older and larger and more indifferent than any empire. The desert did not care about Persian ambitions. It did not care about the oracle at Siwa. It cared about nothing at all. It simply was permanent and absolute and patient in a way that empires are not. Cambyses himself died not long after the loss of his army. The circumstances of his death are murky, possibly a wound, possibly suicide, possibly something else. And the Persian Empire went through a period of crisis and succession. The oracle at Siwa remained intact. The desert remained silent. And somewhere beneath its surface, perhaps, the bones of 50,000 soldiers are still settling into the sand, their weapons corroding at a geological pace, waiting for the wind to bring them up again. Silence and concealment were also the defining conditions of a mystery far closer to home. Not in the desert, but in the heart of the most powerful state in Europe, in a cell in a fortress whose name alone was synonymous with the arbitrary power of an absolute monarchy. The identity of the man known as the Man in the Iron Mask has been a question for 3.5 centuries, and it remains, in the strictest technical sense, unanswered. The identity has not been definitively proven. What we know is this. For approximately 3 decades, from the late 1660s until his death in 1703, a prisoner was held in various French state prisons, culminating in the Bastille. He was kept in conditions of extraordinary security, not physical hardship, by the accounts that survive, but extreme isolation and concealment. Guards were reportedly instructed that he was never to be seen, never to speak to anyone without a guard present, never to remove his mask in the presence of others. He died in the Bastille in November 1703, was buried the following day under an assumed name, and his cell was immediately stripped and repainted, the furniture destroyed, as if to erase any physical trace of his presence. He wore, according to the sources, not an iron mask, but a mask of black velvet. The iron mask is a later embellishment, most famously enshrined in Alexander Dumas's 1848 novel The Vicomte de Bragelonne, which gave the prisoner his romanticized designation and made him a twin brother of Louis XIV, a narrative that is almost certainly fictional. The velvet mask is itself a matter of some historical debate, not appearing in the earliest sources. What appears well documented is the concealment. The prisoner's identity was protected with a thoroughness that was itself conspicuous. Who was he? The theories are numerous and range from the historically plausible to the frankly fantastic. Voltaire was among the earliest to write about the mystery, suggesting the prisoner was Louis XIV's illegitimate older brother. Subsequent theorists have proposed everyone from the Count of Vermandois, an illegitimate son of Louis XIV who reportedly fell from grace, to Nicolas Fouquet, the brilliant finance minister whom Louis had famously imprisoned in 1661. Some researchers have proposed Eustache d'Aguer de Cavois, a low-level courtier who disappears from the historical record at approximately the right time. Some have argued for an Italian count named Girolamo Mattioli, who had embarrassed Louis XIV in a diplomatic matter and whose imprisonment is well documented. though the circumstances don't fit perfectly. The most academically popular candidate among modern historians is Eustache Dogger, not the Cavoy of the same name, but a man who appears in the prison correspondence of the time as a valet of mysterious significance. The letters between the prison governor Saint Mars and the minister of war Louvois regarding this prisoner have been preserved, and they describe someone whose identity was to be protected at all costs and who seemed, strangely, to be not a man of high rank, but a man who knew something or had been present at something that made his continued anonymity a matter of state necessity. This is, in some ways, the most unsettling interpretation. The grand theories, the royal twin, the secret prince, give the prisoner a dignity that matches his mysterious treatment. But if he was simply a valet, a low-ranking servant who happened to witness something he should not have witnessed, then the extreme measures taken to conceal him reflect not the elevation of a great man, but the paranoid thoroughness of a state that found one inconvenient witness worth 30 years of expensive incarceration. Louis XIV was, among other things, one of the most image-conscious rulers in European history. He had constructed the entire apparatus of Versailles, the palace, the court, the ritual, the theater of monarchy, around the maintenance of a particular image of royal power and royal perfection. Something that contradicted or endangered that image was not tolerated. Whatever the prisoner in the velvet mask had seen or knew, it was, apparently, too dangerous to allow him to speak, and too dangerous to allow him to die, because a dead prisoner who died in suspicious circumstances was also a problem. Better to keep him alive, comfortable, masked, and silent, in a cell from which he looked out at nothing and said nothing and remained a question that 3.5 centuries have not yet answered. He died on the 13th of November, 1703. He was buried the following day in the cemetery of St. Paul. The name on his grave was Marchioli. The cell he had occupied was stripped, and the question of who he was went with him into a grave that, like Sandy Island on a different kind of map, marks the location of something that should be there but cannot quite be proven to exist. We know the mask. We do not know the face. And if there is one final testament to the capacity of men and institutions to act in ways that are simultaneously coherent and catastrophically wrong, simultaneously principled and absurdly destructive, let it be the Fourth Crusade and the fall of Constantinople, because in the history of military misadventure, in the entire catalog of expeditions that ended somewhere other than intended, in all the annals of human beings who meant to do one thing and did quite another, this stands. Alone, the Fourth Crusade was launched in 1202 with the intention of recovering Jerusalem. The plan was to attack Egypt, the economic heart of the Islamic world, and use it as a base for the reconquest of the Holy Land. The army was led by the blind and ancient Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, who was somewhere between 80 and 90 years old and possibly completely blind, depending on which source you trust. He was also one of the most ruthlessly capable political operators of the medieval world, and his age and his blindness appear to have done nothing to diminish either his intelligence or his appetite for power. The army of crusaders that assembled in Venice in 1202 was smaller than expected. Not enough soldiers had turned up, and not enough money had been collected to pay for the fleet of ships that Venice had built on contract to transport them. The Crusaders owed Venice 34,000 silver marks. They could not pay it. Dandolo proposed a solution. The Crusaders would delay their departure and help Venice seize the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a trading rival that had recently transferred its allegiance to the King of Hungary. The Crusaders would work off their debt in Venice's service. The Pope was furious. He sent letters forbidding the attack on Zara. The Crusaders attacked Zara anyway. They took it. They wintered there, in a city they had just sacked, having been excommunicated by the Pope for attacking a Christian city on a crusade meant to recover Jerusalem. And then, before they had gone anywhere near Egypt or Palestine, a new opportunity presented itself in the form of a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, who had escaped from Constantinople with a very particular story to tell. His father, the rightful emperor, had been deposed and blinded by a usurper. If the Crusaders would help restore him to his throne, Alexios promised them extraordinary rewards, money, military support, and, crucially, the submission of the Eastern Orthodox Church to the authority of Rome. The last promise was the one most likely to appeal to the Pope. The first promise was the one most likely to appeal to Dandolo. The argument for diverting to Constantinople was made and resisted and finally accepted by enough of the Crusades' leadership to become the plan. In June 1203, the fleet appeared before Constantinople. The city was enormous. Its walls had been considered impregnable for centuries, and the city itself, with its population of hundreds of thousands, its hippodrome, its Hagia Sophia, its accumulated treasures of 1,000 years of civilization, was still, even in its diminished state, the greatest city in the Christian world. The Crusaders, arriving in their ships and looking at those walls, reportedly exclaimed that surely no city in the world could be taken by force. The city was taken by force. The usurper fled. The legitimate emperor was restored, along with his son Alexios IV. And the Crusaders settled outside the city and waited for the promised payments. They did not come. The new emperor could not deliver what his son had promised. The money was not there. The submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome was not within his power to grant. The population of Constantinople, which had greeted the restoration of the legitimate emperor with limited enthusiasm in the first place, grew increasingly hostile to the Latin presence outside the walls. Tensions escalated. There was fire in the city, one of the most catastrophic fires in Constantinople's history, destroying a vast area of the urban fabric. There were riots. The emperor who had promised everything was deposed and then murdered. The Crusaders were now outside a hostile city, owed money they were never going to receive, in the middle of winter, with no plan and no food and no way to get to Egypt. Dandolo, in this situation, made the argument that was both obvious and monstrous: attack the city. Take what was owed. The argument was accepted. On the 12th of April, 1204, the Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople and entered the greatest Christian city in the world, which they spent 3 days sacking. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 is one of those events that resists adequate description, partly because the sources are diverse and not always in agreement on details, and partly because the scale of what was lost is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Constantinople was not simply a city. It was a repository. A millennium of Greek, Roman, Byzantine art and scholarship had been accumulating there. Manuscripts, statuary, relics, icons, architecture, metalwork of incomprehensible refinement. The city contained artifacts that had come from ancient Rome, from ancient Greece, from Alexandria. It was a library of the ancient world as well as the center of medieval Christian civilization. The Crusaders destroyed a significant portion of it, not from malice, or not only from malice, but with the systematic thoroughness of men who had decided that the city's wealth was theirs to take and had no particular framework for evaluating the cultural significance of what they were carrying off or smashing. The bronze horses of the hippodrome, ancient Greek or Roman masterpieces, magnificent beyond description, were taken to Venice, where they remain today above the portal of the Basilica di San Marco. Countless manuscripts were burned or lost. Relics of enormous religious significance were plundered from churches and carried west. The silver and gold ornaments of the Hagia Sophia, one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed, were stripped from its walls. A contemporary Byzantine account describes a prostitute sitting on the patriarch's throne in the Hagia Sophia and singing. Latin crusaders using sacred vessels as drinking cups. The systematic destruction of an archive of human achievement that had no equivalent in Western Europe at that time. The Pope, who had excommunicated the Crusaders for attacking Zara and had forbidden the attack on Constantinople, was placed in the almost impossible position of condemning actions that had, accidentally, delivered to Rome the submission of the Eastern Church, at sword point, temporarily, under duress, but technically. He condemned the sack. He accepted the political reality of the Latin Empire that was established in Constantinople's ruins. He was not comfortable with either choice. The Byzantine Empire survived in exile, in Nicaea, in Trebizond, in Epirus, and eventually reconquered Constantinople in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaiologos. But it never fully recovered. The wealth had been taken. The manuscripts had been burned or scattered. The institutional confidence had been shattered. The deep, unhealed wound between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, a wound that had been formally opened in 1054 with the Great Schism, was made permanent and personal by 1204. The people of Constantinople would not forget what the Crusaders had done to them. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II finally took Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire definitively, some contemporary accounts suggest that many of the city's inhabitants preferred the prospect of Ottoman rule to any further entanglement with the Latin West. That is a complicated historical claim and should not be overstated, but it reflects something real about the depth of the damage done in 1204. The Crusaders who set out to liberate the Holy Land had instead destroyed the largest Christian city in the world, fractured Christendom irrevocably, and handed the Islamic powers of the East a propaganda victory that resonated for centuries. Jerusalem was never recovered. The Fourth Crusade set sail to rescue the Christian world and ended by breaking it. The army that looked at the walls of Constantinople and said no city in the world could be taken by force climbed those walls anyway and burned what they found inside. And the bucket of treasure they carried home to Venice, the bronze horses gleaming on the ships, the looted relics wrapped in stolen cloth. It was all beautiful, and it was all wrong, and the wrongness of it echoes still in the fracture between East and West, in the history of Christianity, in the way that two great branches of the same faith have looked at each other across a millennium and seen, not a brother, but the face of someone who once walked through the door with a sword. These are the stories that the record keeps, not the triumphant ones, or not only those, the ones that resist clean resolution. The frozen river with its bonfire, and its printing press, and its ice that might at any moment crack open. The army walking west into a silence so vast it could hold 50,000 men. The prisoner in the velvet mask sitting in a cell that smelled of old stone and careful forgetting. The bucket in the cathedral, high above the nave, on the end of its chain, proof that people will go to war over anything, and that the things we go to war over are not always the things we say they are. The flower that drove a nation briefly insane. The dead who would not stay buried. The children who walked to a sea that would not open for them. The island that existed on every map but in the world. History does not clean up after itself. It leaves things lying around, in cathedrals, in deserts, in the archives of Venice, in the frozen records of cartographic error. It leaves questions open on purpose, or at least without resolution, because resolution was never the point. The point was the walk toward the sea, the walk into the desert, the walk onto the ice. And the questions that remain when the walking is done are not failures. They are the thing itself, the shape of what we were.